Okay, you're good to go.
Okay, good. Thank you. Well, all right. Hello, everyone.
Share my screen or not yet? Ken?
Yeah, you could go ahead and share your screen. That's
Okay.
good. Yeah. Okay. Hello and welcome to today's session of the workshop. So it's been, in a way, a sad year in the area of computer-aided verification because we lost two people who were pioneers and founders in the area, as well as mentors and friends to many of us. And of course, those are Ed Clarke and Bob Kurshan. So we're going to start in the first session today, remembering Ed and Bob. And we have Orna Grumberg has been kind enough to give us a remembrance of Ed. And then we'll have Kedar Namjoshi, who will be speaking about Bob. And then a number of other people will speak. And also, we will make the session open to anyone who wants to share memories or thoughts about Ed and Bob. And if you'd like to do that in the session, perhaps just put your name in the chat, so I'll be able to call on you. So we need to remember, as always, that the meeting is being recorded. So if you don't want to be recorded, please mute your audio and your video. Also, there is the live transcript that's being made. If you want to turn that off, I'm told there is a button at the bottom of the Zoom window that will let you turn off the live transcript. All right, so I will hand it over to Orna, who's going to give us a remembrance of Ed.
Thank you, Ken. Okay, so Ed was born in 1945 and died last December in the age of 75. And in this talk, I'd like to mention several of his amazing achievements, but also about his personality. So the first, do you see the, oh, sorry, I can't see. Okay, so the first thing that everyone knows about Ed is the ACM Turing Award that he received in 2007 together with Alan Emerson and Joseph Sifakis. And it is interesting to look at the citation of the award. And it says, for the role in developing model checking into a highly efficient verification technology widely adopted in the hardware and software industry. So we note that not only the invention of model checking has been awarded, but also his promotion into a practical technique that can be used in the hardware and software industry to the benefit of the world, actually. And this is one thing that Ed thought it's very, very important. Ed's goal was to make model checking a practical method that can be applied to real life systems and guarantee their correctness and reliability. And this goal he pursued forcefully for more than 35 years with amazing results. His legacy was have a dream, believe in it, and pursue it persistently with all your heart. And this is what he did towards model checking. One thing that he realized is that it's essential to have a very close relationship between academia and industry. So he promoted research that did not have only theoretical contribution, but also a strong practical impact. His approach indeed attracted attendance and publication from the formal verification industry. And to this day, there is a strong collaboration and cross-fertilization between academia and formal verification industry. And this is essential because the problems come from the real life examples, and the academia can be inspired and solve them once they hear about them from the people in the area. Another thing that Ed realized is that it's important to establish a computer-aided verification community in order to have model checking really successful. So together with Bob Kurshan, Amir Pnueli, and Joseph Sifakis, he founded the computer-aided verification, the CAV conference, and together with Bob Kurshan, he established the Journal on Formal Method in System Design, and both our venues where many publications on formal verification goes. And also Ed and Bob established the CAV Award, as they said it, for fundamental contribution to the field of computer-aided verification. All this formed a community that gives us a sense of belonging and care about this whole area. I will mention just a few of the significant breakthroughs that Ed brought to us together with his group, usually his group at Carnegie Mellon, and then I'll go in detail for each one of them. So in 1981, it was model checking itself that he suggested, actually invented, together with Alan Emerson. Then in 1990, he suggested, together with Ken and others, the BDD-based symbolic model checking. And in 1999, it was SAT-based bounded model checking. I saw here Armin Beer, who was part of it. And again, it was a group work. And in 2000, the counterexample guided abstraction refinement, and Somesh, who is in the audience, was part of it. And he had many more contributions to model checking, and all of them were recognized with awards and prizes. So let's go to model checking first. What we have here is a system and specification. And the question is, does the system satisfy the specification? And there are a few main ideas that made this idea quite fascinating and eventually successful. So first of all, before suggesting this problem, logicians were interested in other problems such as satisfiability and validity. Satisfiability just look at a specific formula and ask whether it has one model at least, and validity look at a specific formula and ask whether every possible model satisfies it. In contrast, model checking is given a specific model and a formula and ask whether this specific model satisfies the formula. And this is completely different, and the strength of this problem is that it exactly expresses program verification. The second great idea about the initial algorithms for model checking is that they take the logical problem of model checking and transform it into a graph traversal algorithm like depth first search, breadth first search, strongly connected components, etc., that were very familiar and very well understood. And that way the algorithm could be efficient relative to then. The next one was to choose the temporal logic CTL rather than LTL. CTL consists of only state formulas and therefore can be checked in a modular fashion, whereas LTL has a more global view of the model and need the whole model in order to determine whether it holds or not. So all these were ideas that were very useful for the initial stage of model checking. And for this, we could say that it was a naive algorithm. Some subtle bugs were found in hardware design, but the design themselves consisted of only a few thousand of states, something like 10 Boolean variables. And there was a feeling that we need something which is much more scalable in order to cope with the state explosion problem, which refers to the very, very large number of states in a realistic model. So the next thing was the BDD-based symbolic model checking. And the idea there is to use binary decision diagram, BDDs, suggested by Bryant, which were a data structure to represent Boolean function. And in symbolic model checking, BDDs are used to represent the model and the set of states. Their strength is that they can easily be used to compute fixed point, which are suitable for computing set of states satisfying CTL formulas. And the symbolic model checking can handle system with a few hundreds of Boolean variables. And this was indeed a game changer. It attracted the attention of the hardware industry. First, they were just using Ken Macmillan tools, tool SMV, in order to apply model checking in their environment. Later on, they built their own tool, but the fact that we moved from 10 Boolean variables to 100 of Boolean variables made the whole difference. The advantage of BDDs were that often, but not always, they are concise in size. The BDDs are greatly depend on the order of variables, and this is somewhat problematic. They have a canonical representation once we fix the order, and therefore it's easy to check equivalence between Boolean function. This is useful. And most Boolean operators can be performed on BDDs in polynomial time in the BDD size. The disadvantage of BDDs is exactly their dependence on the variable order, and it has been shown that finding an optimal variable order is a hard problem, and therefore heuristics were used. At this point, the feeling was that some new ideas are needed for scalability. As for the next step, which was SAT-based, I was really witnessing how it happened. So in CAV 1997, there was an invited speaker telling about a new concept, nobody was aware of it, of a SAT solver. This SAT solver was based on Stallmark's method and was developed by Prover Technology at Sweden. This was a fascinating talk, and I saw that Ed was fascinated about it. And then when I came to visit Ed in the next summer in 1998, Ed was reading books and papers concerning with the SAT solving. So Ed had the habit of getting up at 4 a.m. and read some mathematics books on mathematics in his first few hours of each day. And in this summer, he dedicated his reading to books and papers related to SAT. And then the next summer I came to visit, I was told that Ed Group developed what was called SAT-based bounded model checking. It was emphasized that there is no BDDs, and this was actually the next step to scalability of model checking. So this shows some of Ed's visionary, because he held some idea, some new notion that was new to all of us, but I think most of the people didn't spend much time on this new, quite exotic idea. And then he made it into practice together with his group. So what is the SAT-based bounded model checking? It describes computation of the model up to length k and the negated specification as a propositional formula. It then sends it to a SAT solver to check satisfiability of the formula. And if the formula is satisfiable, then a bug of length k is found. And if the formula is unsatisfiable, then k is increased. Bounded model checking terminates with a counterexample, or usually with time or memory out. Because once k becomes very, very large, SAT solver cannot cope with it. The method is mainly suitable for falsification, not verification. It can handle models with thousands of Boolean variables. And to this day, SAT-based bounded model checking is the most widely used in practice, in industry, for instance, to solve difficult verification problems. So since then, we have many, many other approaches. Some are SAT-based, but still bounded model checking is one of the most widely used on hard problem. Then there were other approaches to solving the state explosion problem. And the main idea here was to replace the full concrete model with some small model that still preserve the correctness of the specification under consideration. So there were several such approaches using abstraction or compositional verification, partial order reduction, and symmetry, and Ed contributed to most of them, actually all of them. So let's look only shortly at abstraction. Abstraction removes or simplifies details or sometimes entire components that are irrelevant to the property under consideration in order to reduce the model size, the number of states and transitions. And finding good abstraction manually is hard to do, and therefore the goal is to automatically construct an abstract model that preserves the checked property, and if the abstraction is not detailed enough, to apply refinement. And for this, we developed the counterexample guided abstraction refinement, which named CIGAR, but by Ed himself. And the idea was to automatically construct an initial abstraction based on the checked property and the system. And if this abstraction satisfies the formula, then we are fine, and we know that the formula holds. And if there is a counterexample that is spurious, then we use it to refine the abstraction. So this is just a handful of ideas and contribution that Ed provided. But let's go back to Ed as a person. Ed was a devoted scientist. He was a scholar, a visionary, and a leading figure to all his many students, postdocs, and visitors. He was also a loving and devoted family man. And Ed and Marta, his wife, who is here with us, formally welcomed all his visitors and made them feel at home. Ed built a strong formal verification group around him at Carnegie Mellon. He encouraged collaboration among his students and his many visitors, and this formed an inspiring atmosphere that resulted in so many great outcomes. Over the years, if I count well, Ed had more than 30 PhD students and 40 postdocs, and many, many visitors, some coming back again and again, like myself. I think I visited there for almost 30 years, and it was a pleasure and inspiring visit. In Ed's retirement event, about 100 participants came to show their appreciation, and these participants were coming from more than 20 countries. This just show how widely spread Ed influence and vision and knowledge went around the world in both academia and industry. We will all miss him. Thank you.
Thank you, Orna. That was very nice. So yeah, I mean, I think that I mean, just to add a comment there, there's something about the way that Ed approached a problem, and to me, you know, the thing that he did more than, you know, these individual techniques of, you know, model checking and CGAR and the BDD based techniques and so on, was really to introduce a paradigm, you know, or a way of thinking about systems, which was very different from what came before, you know, from the sort of program verification approach that people had taken, where you want to think of the problem in terms of trying to fit your verification problem into a particular abstract model and a particular logic, you know, where you can get automation, you know, and that has had so much influence, you know, over the years in so many areas, and we come to, I think, to just think of that as second nature, right? But that's really something to me that Ed introduced that was really fundamental, was this sort of paradigm of doing research in this area. So anyway, so I just wanted to add that. Does anyone else have questions or other, you know, comments about you know, Ed's contributions or anything else?
I can say, this is Somesh, I can say a couple of things. I mean, one thing that I really appreciated about Ed was, I think for old timers, we remember, I mean, how much he really cared about the students. If you remember, the old timers probably remember that we used to mail the papers physically for conferences. I don't know whether, I think this probably the new people probably don't remember that he had a list of all the, you know, the latest things that you could drop the paper, the latest. And then, you know, I used to live in Shadyside, which was not a great area back then. And then we would sort of be driving to places and then he will drive me back home. So, you know, there was this really that, you know, if you joined his group, there was this really caring mentality that I think, and even throughout my career, he was there. And if I needed to chat about something, just to call him up. And, you know, it was that sort of like, I think, again, this has nothing to do with his technical side, but that human aspect was really, I mean, I think remarkable.
Yeah, I mean, there was something about the way that Ed would just get excited about new ideas, you know, exactly, that would just make you want to go and work on them, you know. Yeah. He had that quality. Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, this is Randy.
Hi, Randy.
Oh, can I jump in?
Please.
Sure.
So I benefited a lot by being in Ed's shadow, in particular, having all of his students and postdocs that I could learn from as well. And so I got to see, Ed and I did a little collaboration, but also I just got a chance to interact and see how he worked. And I really admire him. If you think about a lot of his key ideas and insights really came to him through his students. So the idea of applying model checking to hardware, that came, I think, was it Mike Brown was the first one, and then David Dill. And the idea of symbolic model checking came through Ken, and BMC I know Armin was a big part of that. So, and
Right.
more recently, he did really interesting work on real arithmetic decision procedures. Fascinating work, all arising from a student in the philosophy department, Sean Gao. And he really was able to, like you said, Ken, take some idea and jump into it, but also have his students or his visitors or postdocs really join in that and really move into whole new directions that way. It's very admirable how he could do that.
Yeah, somehow he had this amazing ability of just recognizing a good idea, you know, and seeing the potential in it, you know, that I think, you know, and having that enthusiasm for it, you know, that I think was a part of, you know, why he was so successful in so many cases.
I think Dave has raised his hand.
Yeah,
Yeah,
was
I was kind of holding back because I had comments about both Ed and Bob, but I think I should comment on Ed. So at CMU, you know, I'm going to contradict Randy. I'm going to correct Randy. His first student at CMU was Bud Mishra, now at NYU, and I was the second student. Mike Brown and some of the other great students came along a little bit after that. So I think Bud found the first bug in a hardware design, and I found the second one or whatever. But I'm not going to comment about Ed's technical contributions. And I could say a lot more than I could add both perspectives and additional things because there were just so many of them. And he was such a great scientist. But wanted to comment on his impact on me personally. You know, I was at his retirement party in Pittsburgh a few years ago, and I almost didn't go, but Martha was pretty persistent in encouraging all his students to show up. And I'm so glad that I showed up because I got to express not to just to this community, but to Ed, how much he had meant to me in my career. I was not on an academic track at CMU. I hope I would have finished my PhD, but I was really struggling as a student. I had two advisors, both of whom are fantastic PhD students, fantastic computer scientists, both of whom left CMU in the first 2 years. And then I went around hunting for my third advisor, and Ed had just moved to Carnegie Mellon from Harvard. And, you know, I thought I wanted to do compiler optimization or static analysis or something. And I ended up with him. And in his way, he, you know, I was lost. I was working hard. I cared a lot about research, but I just didn't know how to do it. And his gentle encouragement to, you know, work on the problem of model checking that he had just found. And, you know, when I would come in and make some suggestion or have some observation that made no sense at all, he would just ask me a few questions and I couldn't answer them. And I would think, you know, it would really be great if I could answer questions like this when Ed asked me next time. And so by this sort of no negative feedback at all and just treating me as a colleague and, you know, somehow nurturing my weaknesses, I transformed in less than 2 years to, you know, I wrote my first conference paper. And I remember after presenting that paper, somebody came up to me from a major university and said, basically asked when I was going to be finishing my PhD and be on the job market. And so that was the kind of transition I made. And so, of course, eventually I ended up at Stanford, and Ed continued to collaborate and to provide fabulous mentoring, including helping me out of a couple of scrapes that I'm not going to go into detail on, but academic conflicts and whatever, just a font of very useful advice as well as technical interchange. So I feel it, you know, somebody asked me, I've retired from Stanford, somebody asked me, you know, for some generic advice, and I found myself babbling about, you know, how my career went and whatever. And when it got down to explaining how did I get this great job at Stanford, it was luck. And, you know, I assume that my qualities had something to do with it, but it was not foredestined. It was a major lucky break for me. And the biggest lucky break there was ending up with Ed as my advisor. It changed my whole life.
Yeah, I can just say ditto to that for the moment. Yeah, I really appreciate that, Dave. So I think that it's time now to move on and have Kedar's presentation on Bob Kurshan, and then we'll have plenty more time at the end of the session to talk about both both Ed and Bob. So Kedar, please go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Ken. So, it's an honor to give a talk remembering Bob Kurshan as both a colleague, a friend, a mentor, not just to me, but to many others here. So I want to list, like Orna did, I don't want to just, give the major accomplishments, but also to kind of go behind them to see, what he really cared about, what his environment was like at Bell Labs when he joined. And I know that that's going to paint an incomplete picture. So I'm really glad that there's, all of you who can add to what I have to say here. So I'll start by saying, I first met Bob as a graduate student in the 1990s. And that was now almost 25 years ago, but I have a very vivid memory of, Bob standing up to ask a question. So I think this was at some SRC review meeting. He stood up very straight with his hands jammed into his jeans pockets. This is a very typical Bob stance for people who've been around him. And he asked, I think it was some hapless graduate student, a really crisp and sharp and difficult question. And so it was obvious then that, Bob knew everything there was to know about program verification. He knew the theory, he knew the implementation. He had built CoSpan up into, what was, I think then the most industrial strength, if you could call it, verification tool. And so one would naturally assume, as I did, that he had a computer science or electrical engineering background. But that wasn't true at all. Bob was actually a mathematician. He was, in fact, not just an applied mathematician, but a pure mathematician. So this is from, the math genealogy. He got his PhD at the University of Washington in 1968. His advisor was James Chance, and his dissertation title you can read for yourself. I have no idea what most of those words mean. I just know that they have to do with abstract algebra and with the theory of rings. So when Bob graduated, he moved, I think immediately to Bell Labs, which he joined in '68. And I remember him telling me once that he knew that he wanted to live in New York City, and he knew that he wanted to work in industrial research. So that was really narrowing down the possibilities. So he only had, Bell Labs and TJ Watson that he could apply to. And he applied to both. I think he got offers from both, decided to join Bell Labs, and stayed at Bell Labs for the next almost 35 years. So the math center at Bell Labs was small, but world famous. I think the main work there, or the major jewel in the crown, was, of course, information theory and coding theory. Hamming was still here at the time, but there was groundbreaking work going on in many fields, in combinatorics and statistics and machine learning. The early work. Algorithms, optimization, all sorts of fields. And there was a fledgling computer science group as well. But, all of this is applied math. Now, why would they hire an algebraist, a pure mathematician? So I don't really know the answer, but I can guess. And I think my best guess is from this wonderful quote from Sam Morgan, who was then in charge of the computer science group. And this is from an interview in 1989. And it's so good that I think I should read it out loud. So he says the management principles here are that you hire bright people, you introduce them to the environment, you give them some general directions, and then you give them lots of freedom. And what this made possible is, a time when researchers had considerable freedom to experiment with ideas, to try things, to fail, and to kind of find their own way. So to give you sort of yet another sense of what Bell Labs would have been around that time, Dennis Ritchie and Ken Thompson had just been hired. They were not working on Unix yet, but I think that was just a year ahead in 1969 that they started work on Unix. Jeff Ullman and Al Aho had also just been hired. They'd been there for maybe a couple of years. They'd been working on parsing methods and possibly thinking about their first book out of many wonderful books together. And on the physics side, there was Arthur Ashkin, who's the one on the right, who was just starting his experiments on laser trapping, which won him a Nobel Prize 2 or 3 years ago. The person on his left is Steve Chu, who also won a Nobel Prize some years ago. And there was Willard Boyle and George Smith, who would invent the CCD sensor a year later, like in 1969. And that's what is making this Zoom call and digital photography possible. So it was clearly an exciting time to be at Bell Labs, and Bob was very happy there. So for the next 15 years, Bob worked on digital filtering and periodic sequences, things to do with signal processing. And I could not explain what most of these things are. But his frequent collaborator was somebody called B. Gopinath, also called Gopi. And here are some publications from that period. So I took a look at some of them, and the one that intrigued me the most was his very first publication, the one from 1970, which has this very interesting title. I was curious what bubble programs were, so I looked it up. So it turns out, so once you look at this from my view, it's basically a reachability calculation done by a mathematician. So you can see that Ron Graham came up with this model of n little magnets that could interact with each other somehow, and he tried to characterize what the reachable configurations would be of this system, and I think he only had a partial answer, and then Bob came along and had yet another partial answer. He in effect showed an invariant property of this system. So he showed that anything that was reachable could be expressed as an elementary symmetric Boolean polynomial. So he was sort of happily working on mathematics, working on I guess signal processing, but around 1980 his research direction was to shift quite dramatically. And so the shift and the trigger, again, from what I heard from Bob, was the development of an early networking protocol by people at Bell Labs. And so the first version of the protocol had bugs. They fixed those. Then they found even more subtle bugs. They fixed those. They found more bugs. And it seemed as if this wasn't going to converge to anything stable and correct. And so Bob was intrigued. And I have a very vague memory of him telling me that he went home and sort of wrote up a little protocol analyzer in Fortran, because I guess that was the one language that he knew he was familiar with, and showed that you could analyze this protocol with Fortran and come up with interesting results in terms of configurations. So now this could very well have been like a one-time thing that he did. He could have gone back to doing digital filtering and math, but then he took a leap of faith. He decided to completely change his research focus from what he'd been doing before to this new area of protocol analysis, what we now know as model checking. And this was around 1981 or so. The phrase model checking had just been introduced, although I think he was unaware of that. And what he did was, along with his colleague and very good friend, Gopi, he came up with his own sort of idiosyncratic model of concurrent processes, which some of us know. I see Ken nodding, so he definitely knows about this. So it was called the selection resolution model. And the way it works is that you have a number of processes. At any given point, each process has a collection, a selection, makes a selection. It has a number of possible next moves. And then the system as a whole chooses a consistent set of selections. And then all the processes move in one step to in one time unit to the next state. So this is basically a synchronous execution model, but it's written this way. So what's fun when you go through this is that you sort of see the algebraist coming through. So the selections are expressed as a label algebra, a Boolean algebra. The transition relation is expressed as a tensor product. So this is how Bob liked to think about the problem, and it's very natural given his background. What's also interesting is the very first sentence of the abstract. It says, many models that are currently used to analyze concurrent processes suffer from incompleteness, vagueness, or intractable complexity. So he wasn't impressed with what was being done in protocol analysis around that time. And this is very much the mathematician in him speaking. So he was, he didn't like vagueness for sure. So within a year, he had implemented the first version of CoSpan, which is an acronym of Coordination, Analyzer, and Specifier. And it was done as an explicit state model checker. And he continued working on CoSpan for the rest of his career. So as a very side note, I realized when I was looking at these documents that Bob hadn't changed his office or his phone number for at least 20 years. I met him almost 20 years later. And he still had the same office and the same phone number. So yeah, so then in the 1980s, I guess the main event in retrospect is, of course, the founding of the CAV conference, which Orna also talked about. And this was the second workshop. I think the first one was in Grenoble in 89, but this was held at DIMAX down in Rutgers and published as, oddly enough, as by also the American Mathematical Society. So which I think, again, maybe was a connection that Bob had. So, and Bob, of course, continued developing CoSpan. He really wanted this method to be practical and in use. So what I want to highlight now are just a few of his actual work, the work that he did on his own, while he was also promoting CAV and verification technology. So one is a very nice paper, which I read as a grad student by Kurshan and a certain K. Macmillan, who was, I think, then intern at Bell Labs. So this is a very elegant way of proving properties for parametric systems. It's basically the main innovation is to use a process as an invariant, as an inductive invariant. And so Bob, being a mathematician, I think was very aware that you couldn't just throw a large program at a verification tool and expect to get an answer out of it. He very much wanted to build up a methodology of modular or compositional verification, a divide and conquer method. And he tried this in many different ways and in many different settings. And so he kept coming back to that problem over and over again. So the other one of the other really important papers is this by Rajiv Allur, who had I think must have just joined Bell Labs at the time, Alon Itai and Mihalis Yannikakis. And this was an early form of what we now call CGAR, which Orna already introduced. So the way it worked was that you wanted to show real-time properties, and that was a complex calculation. So you sort of started small and then used the counter examples to decide, which components to include and how to refine the composition as you went along. Now, Bob then later on developed the CGAR method in his own way, but in an interesting anecdote that he actually revealed only much later. This is a paper by Ed, Bob, and Helmut, and they're neither of them with us, unfortunately. But this was at Amir Pinelli's like an event, a remembrance event for Amir. And what Bob revealed was that the publication office at Bell Labs had blocked publication of his work on localization reduction and his ideas on counterexample refinement, because they thought it would sort of give away secrets for this commercial product that they were starting to build on top of CoSpan. So this is very unusual. It's maybe the very few instances I know of where this sort of publication of material has been blocked for commercial reasons. So now Bob continued to build up CoSpan and verification. He wrote a book where he actually explains some of the CGAR method, but unfortunately, I think many people, including me, just missed reading that in his book. It was partly because of his unfamiliar notation that made it hard to read. And the next big event was when Cadence brought out, I think, the entire design automation group at Lucent in 1998 in a very big deal at the time. So this is from the Wall Street Journal. They report that it was valued at about 90 million. And the article goes on to say that a major component of, or the major reason for the deal was the verification technology that had been developed at Bell Labs. And this is basically CoSpan along with front ends for Verilog and VHDL and all their experience applying it to chip design within Lucent. So this is a very big deal. But Bob stayed on at Bell Labs for actually several years. And this is around the time where I come in, so kind of late in the story. So I joined Bell Labs soon after this, actually in June, I think, 98. And initially as a postdoc and then as a member of Mihalis Yannakakis' group. So this was a very nice group to be in with lots of wonderful colleagues, many of whom you know. And I started, I went down to Bob's office to just talk about questions to work on. And so he gave me this interesting little puzzle. So I'll spend a couple of minutes on this. So he said, one can design a circuit for an expression of this type. If A, then G, Fx, else F, Gx, a combinatorial circuit, without replicating either F or G in the following way. So you just write down a block for F, you put down a block for G. So there's only one instance of each. And then you wire them in this interesting way. That's the V0 and V1. And it turns out that when you draw the wires, I just didn't have time to draw the picture, but when you draw the wires, there's a circularity. So you can see this, if we just sort of do a rough dependence analysis, then V0 depends upon U1, U1 depends upon V1, V1 depends upon U0, U0 depends upon V0, back again. Okay. So most, so the natural inclination is to throw this out because circular dependencies are really bad for combinatorial circuits. But it turns out that in this particular circuit, the input A is an input, resolves the circularity. And it resolves it in two different ways, which is how you get this GFX and FGX. And you can kind of work through this and see that for yourself. And the question was, how do we recognize the semantically correct circuits and you separate them from the ones where the circularity is real and it's actually going to lead to an instability. And so he pointed me to work by Gerard Berry and by Sharad Malik on this problem. They had solved it using fixed points. So they would compute some kind of fixed point and then look at the fixed point value and decide whether things were good or bad. And I thought that there should be like a non-computational, a sort of, a declarative way of deciding whether things were right or wrong. And so I went back and thought about it. And in a couple of weeks, I sort of figured out that you could sort of reduce this problem essentially to a 3-valued satisfiability problem. And so I came back and told Bob, and he was happy and surprised. And also it turned out a little taken aback because he then told me that he had been thinking about this problem off and on for a few years without any success. he had tried to shop it around to various people, again, without success. And so he was quite surprised when I came up with the solution. So, but then he wanted me to implement it. And so CoSpan then was a few 100,000 lines of code. It was a very daunting task, but actually one that I ended up enjoying in the end. And this kind of shows you the two sides of Bob. I mean, he was, as a mathematician, he was happy with the solution. He thought it was nice and elegant. But from his practical side, he wanted it implemented and tried out and tested. And so the solution made it into CoSpan, and then later on into Cadence. And I think it was used for a few years just to resolve things. So this became our first paper together. We had a couple of others, one with Nina and then one with on predicate abstraction. But around, I think 2002 or 3, Bob decided to retire from Bell Labs after 35 years and moved to Cadence, where he continued to develop formal check. And I don't know that part of the story well, but Ken, for instance, could sort of contribute some of his thoughts on that. So I'll just say that Bob was known to ask difficult questions at talks. And as a result, he had a kind of reputation among graduate students, at least when I was a graduate student, of being someone who was tough and difficult to work with. And in fact, for a couple of years after I joined Bell Labs, people would come up to me at conferences and ask, how did I manage to get along so well with Bob? What was the secret? Turns out there wasn't a secret. I mean, he was very particular. He had high standards about both the mathematics, the research, and the writing. And he disliked, fuzzy statements and woolly thinking. And since we agreed on all of these, we got along very well. But as a person, he was thoughtful and generous and incredibly kind in small and big ways. And so it was a pleasure working with him. So I'll sort of wrap up here. So he won many awards for his work. He was a distinguished member of technical staff at Bell Labs, a fellow at Cadence, and a recipient of the Kanellakis Theory and Practice Awards. But none of that went to his head. He was just a very normal person and enjoyable person to be with, someone you could just have a nice conversation with at any time. So I've left Bob's family to the end because it is clearly the most important part of his life. So his wonderful wife, Miri, here, his kids, Perry and Eri, and now their grandkids, he really adored. And he was incredibly proud of their accomplishments. I remember he was sort of gushing about when Perry went to college, when she got her, I think, a postdoc position in Australia. He was really, really proud of what she was doing. And also he, as many of you know, he delighted in spending time with them. They had annual ski trips to Utah, hikes in the summer. Bob was very adventurous. He and Miri, I think, did a trip to Antarctica once. He went hiking in the Himalayas. So he was just this very interesting personality, and someone I will always remember with lots of affection and respect. So thank you. And I'm looking forward to hearing your memories of Bob.
Thanks very much, Kedar. That was a lot of great material. It was interesting to go back through some of that. So does anyone else have things to add to things that Kedar was saying about Bob? Yeah, I mean, I'll say a few things. I mean, the things that Kedar was talking about with Bob and his his formalism for processes with tensor products and so on, all of that. I mean, this was something that one of the first tasks that Ed gave me as a graduate student was actually to review this paper of Bob's. And I didn't understand any of it. All of the language was unfamiliar, and all of the formalism and so on. But the amazing thing about it was that at that point, he already sort of had the whole package. He had not only the idea of model checking, having some notion of a model and a property that you wanted to verify, and expressing omega regular properties and so on. But he had the whole picture of abstraction and composition and hierarchical verification. He had an idea of how the whole thing was going to scale, up to large systems, and had already started putting that in practice with protocols at Bell Labs. And it was just remarkable that he had all that together, and it was in a completely idiosyncratic way. It was very different from the way that other people had approached it, but he had just thought that all through himself and put it all together. And I think that has, it's sort of in a way is similar, the thinking was similar to the way that Ed was approaching, the Ed and Alan, were approaching verification, where you say, instead of, I'm thinking about proof systems for large programs, which is where Ed had started out, instead thinking about abstractions and algorithms, and how you put the verification problem into the right form to be able to solve it. I think there was something that Bob was saying about that in Kedar's presentation, and those were both, to me, kind of the same view, right? The same paradigm or fundamental idea. And it was just remarkable that Bob had come up with all of that by himself. Another thing about Bob, this is right what Kedar is saying. Bob would, he was a very rigorous and precise thinker, and that might come off as being sort of stubbornness, but the thing was, it actually was really easy to get along with Bob, right? And to me, this was because you could have an argument with Bob about anything. You could have a vociferous discussion, a disagreement, points of view. You could finally come to some agreement, and there would never be any hard feelings. And Bob would never take anything the wrong way. He was just completely imperturbable. And all he wanted to do was just get to the solution. And whatever problem it was, he would just work through till he got to the solution. He was just amazingly what's the word? He had just this amazing persistence, in solving a problem, which I think had a lot to do with the success that he had, and it just made him great to work with, in that way. So, does anyone else have?
I have a kind of funny anecdote about Bob. So I remember when I did the symmetry thing, and he was very interested in it because I guess he has a little bit of, he had the algebraic bent. And Patrick Cousseau was visiting, and I explained the symmetry reduction to Patrick, and Patrick Cousseau gave me like this blank look, what the heck is this guy doing? And then I remember Al Emerson had the same Al and Prasad Sisla had the result at on the same time, same cap.
Right.
And Al was very clever. He explained to Patrick Cousseau in this alpha, beta, this whole abstraction and Patrick thought this was the best idea since sliced bread, though, so I think Bob was visiting it, and I went to Bob, I said, what the heck happened here? It's the same exact idea. He said, oh, Al was really clever. You have to speak the terminology of the person. And so I've taken that, when I'm now talking to a person, you basically say, okay, who's sitting at the next table? Who are you speaking to? And then you explain it in that terminology that they understand. I've sort of taken that advice and taken throughout my career. So, he was very generous with his advice. And I don't know, Kedar, I didn't find him ever very hard to get along with. He was pretty generous, I thought, with his.
No, I didn't. I think it was, I didn't either. I'm just saying that this was an impression that, sometimes like he would ask questions in this very terse, crisp manner, and it kind of came across as being somebody who might be difficult to get along with. And so I know many people did come up to me and ask me, how I did it.
Okay, yeah, but this is very pleasant memories of every interaction with Bob.
Mm-hmm.
Does anyone else?
Kedar, one thing that you did address, Bob always looked like he was coming off a camping trip. So
I think he always was.
Yeah. I mean, I think he wore jeans. I've never seen him in anything other than jeans. And he actually had this little anecdote about how he caused quite a stir by showing up to work on his first day in jeans and maybe even a t-shirt. So, I mean, this was completely, this is 1960s. It wasn't quite, jacket and tie type dress code, but it was pretty formal. And Bell Labs ultimately was part of a phone company. Like, they were very conservative. And
It would have been slacks and a white shirt.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Hopefully with the sleeves rolled up. Yeah, well, that was, I think it was his claim to fame. I think that he was the first person to wear blue jeans at Bell Labs.
Right.
So,
Right.
what he said. But, yeah.
actually, another thing that struck me with both Ed and Bob is that they were kind of steeped in pure mathematics, but they were really they took great pride in being blue collar workers.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, right, about both Ed and Bob. I mean, had this strong focus on making it work and doing something practical. That was in their points of view. That was also very, very similar. And of course, Bob had come at the whole verification thing from a completely practical point of view. Starting with a practical problem. Okay, so why don't we, let's see, I think that there were some others who had maybe prepared some remarks or who would like to say a few things. Aarti, are you with us? Oh, I don't know if.
I don't see her on the list yet.
Okay, yeah, so I don't know. David, was there anything else that you wanted to add to things you said before, or?
I typed in a comment to the chat window. I guess I can summarize a little bit. I think Bob got some awards, but he was in the company of a lot of Turing Award winners, and I think that he's under-recognized for his technical contributions. So his technical contributions even exceed his recognition, I'll put it that way. And it's partly, maybe mostly, a combination of an uncompromising presentation style. Several people have mentioned the tensor product for what is essentially intersection of regular languages. And also, kind of modesty, where I think he really didn't care about awards. I never heard him mention any kind of envy of anybody else or whatever. I know that he influenced me. He came to Carnegie Mellon several times as while I was a graduate student to talk to Ed about things, and I picked up, just in casual conversation, a number of ideas which had a pretty profound influence on my direction in graduate school and later. After I was an assistant professor at Carnegie Mellon, Bob was at Cadence, and it was in the Semiconductor Research Corporation, which funded me for several years. And Bob was, very helpful, giving me advice both about technical things, comparing notes and technical conversations, and just organizational issues like how do you get what problems do you run into when you're trying to do practical verification work in an organization, and how to get along with SRC and that sort of thing. So he was extremely kind man and very generous to junior people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can definitely second all of those thoughts. And Bob was always willing to help more junior people. He was very much a mentor to me, and he was very generous with his time and with his experience and expertise. So we can open up and let's see, is there anyone else that would Randy, did you have anything that you wanted to add about, because I know we didn't have, there's still, we still have plenty of time, and if if there are things that you'd like to add about Ed or
Well, I'll just, my first encounter with Bob was I was assigned the task of organizing a tutorial at the Design Automation Conference on formal verification. And somebody told me, I don't remember exactly who, oh, you should get this guy Kurshan, he's from Bell Labs and they have real world experience. And so I recruited him. And as we were developing the material, I could kind of tell that this presentation wasn't going to work, but I really didn't know how to describe it to him. So I just kind of let it happen. And the tutorial was more or less a train wreck because most of the participants really couldn't understand him at all. But toward the end, he kind of went off script and he started talking more about what it was like to apply his stuff working with the real product groups at AT&T on these tools. And I think he had some pretty useful insights to it. And then afterwards he goes, so did you know this would go so badly? I said, yeah, I kind of did. He goes, well, why didn't you tell me? I said, wow, I couldn't quite convey it to you, but he
Oh, that's funny.
hides to him.
Okay, I'm sorry, Randy, I think that, did we lose your audio?
Yeah, the last few seconds.
That's all I had to say.
Yeah, okay. Marvelous. And so, yeah, so Orna, you worked quite a bit with, do you have memories that you'd like to share about Bob, as well as Ed?
So first of all, I worked with him even before I met him because I worked with Ed and Ed worked with Bob. And then we had a paper together and I didn't meet him. And at some point I went to a conference, probably CAV, and I went to Bob to introduce myself and I saw a huge person, a very frightening one with his voice. And I had to come and introduce myself. And then he was very, very kind and pleasant. And then I worked with him at Bell Labs for a year. I was on a sabbatical. And this was a very nice experience. Yeah. And at that time, we went out to New York and I met Miri, his wife. It was nice. He was a very pleasant person.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, he looked so strong. It's a stupid remark, but he looked so strong and he didn't seem to ever disappear or die on us. It was impossible.
It was very much, I know, it's very much a shock. It's very hard to imagine, especially having, hiked up Half Dome in Yosemite with Bob, and he was so hard to keep up with. He was just such a physical force, as well as being an intellectual force. It was really hard, to imagine.
Yeah.
So Armin, is there anything that you'd like to share about working with Ed or?
Yes. Okay. Can you hear me? I had an issue with the mic. Yeah, so maybe one thing, so I'm not sure, but Ed was always envy of all the other people doing a startup. And then I happened to be in a place where he was approached to do a startup. So, but now my video is frozen.
I can, actually, it's okay here.
Okay, then I continue. Anyhow, so as I think then because he envied the others and because we had this boundary model checking, Ed was convinced to do this, to join us with this VSOW04 company, right? And I have one anecdote there. So we had a meeting in Germany, in Berlin, and I was driving. You see, I'm German, so I was driving through Berlin, and Ed got really, really scared because we had a non-automatic driving, right? And of course, I had to keep my hand on the not on the steering wheel. And he always kept saying, I mean, can't you keep the hands on the steering wheel? And then later, like when he went to the US for the companies, same in Fremont, he insisted on trying. And this was a little bit scary, for me scary, because when he went onto the highway, he didn't look back, right? And I think in California, this doesn't matter, right? You can just like, I don't know, like go 70 and then slowly go to the left. So he also returned the favor to me to scare me in driving. So
I see.
that's an anecdote I want to share.
Driving differences, yeah. Yeah. Right.
So Ken, I can add a few words about both of them. So, listening to the beautiful presentations from Orna and Kedar, actually, it was like reliving parts of my life, going back to, the 80s and 90s. One of the things we really enjoyed was, having visits from people like Amir and Ed and Randy and Bob at that time, and they really influenced us a lot in many ways. And one thing that they both shared is that they were both in many ways tenacious, but very open-minded. They were really receptive. They were really curious about various things, and in particular they gave you advice that would last a lifetime. I remember, when one of the things that impacted us a lot when Bob visited is that he said, you guys, you're trying to prove big theorems about small systems, and really what the people out there, they don't really have any big theorems. They're worried about small theorems about big systems, and so that stayed with us. That that's something that we thought, okay, that's a kind of life-changing bit of advice. Another thing that was briefly mentioned is that Bob used to go around talking about giving these talks about tech transition. So this was very unusual because he was one of the few people who had any experience actually transferring technology, from Bell Labs to AT&T and all the adventures that go with trying to do something like that, all the impedance mismatches that you encounter. And so this was something that he was very generous about sharing with everyone else. And I think this made a big difference because for a lot of people, this was really meaningful advice that he could provide. So Ed, actually, I first met when Alan said, I was taking classes from Alan Emerson in Texas, and he said, you show up at this conference center, and I'll introduce you to my advisor. And so he proudly introduced me to Ed. I think this would have been like 1983 or something like that. And since then, I've met him like at all kinds of exotic places around the world, and he always maintained an open mind about the kind of synergy between model checking and deductive verification. He himself contributed quite a lot to theorem proving. I think he even has a Herbrand Award for his work in both model checking and theorem proving. So he also he was Bob Constable's student. So this is another connection that he had to deductive verification. And at meetings, I was always really impressed by how clear-cut his responses were. How he would essentially tell people that they should stick to their knitting. They shouldn't be pontificating about things they don't know anything about. I think he mentioned even that his Mata might correct me, that his son was, I think that he said, a geologist. Mata, is that right? Is one of your sons is a
No,
is,
I don't think so. One, I think
or
one
something. I mean, it was some specialization that you're saying that I would never advise him on his field because he knows a lot more about it than I do. And so this is something that I think many of us stray from our expertise and start pontificating on other domains, and he would never do that. So thing I come back to with both of them is that they really, had this vision of, where the field could be, what the impact that it could have, both in terms of its scholarly contributions and its industrial impact. They took the effort to actually see all of this through. They really made the effort to, create conferences, create journals, create startups and joint startups and things like that to make it all possible. And that to me is a life well lived.
Yeah, I would agree with that sentiment. Yeah, definitely. Also, I mean, the thing you mentioned about, the connection between model checking and deductive verification and so forth, I think is something that, this is part of the big picture that a lot of people who work in model checking don't really see, but I think that that Ed and Bob actually both were, seeing the big picture, right, in the sense of saying that this needs to be put together into a larger methodology and so on. Yeah.
And Ken, on that point, this whole idea about, a lot of people are working on these verified implementations now, more from the system side. And sometimes you read those papers and they seem to have completely forgot a lot of the history of verification. And, you say, oh, you didn't cite this paper of Ed and Bob's, you didn't cite this. So it's in the OSDI, even in SIGCOMM community, it's a big thing now, but I read some of the papers and a lot of them don't know the history.
Yeah, that's right. And sometimes, that's right. Because sometimes, especially, an area has been hot and people have worked on it for a long time, and then later other people come at it for a different direction, and they don't really have that.
I think Andre has his hands up, Ken.
Oh, yeah.
That's right.
I don't see that, but Andre, would you like to say something?
Yeah, I'm happy to chime in just from a perspective of having collaborated with Ed and of course I think the floor should belong to students and postdocs, but I think it's an interesting experience of the first paper I wrote with Ed, where all of you know me, so I'm working a lot on symbolic and proof technology for hybrid systems and so on. But with Ed, I was exploring the question, how can that be approached from a model checking and numerical analysis perspective, which was fairly interesting. And then one day I came to the office and said, so unfortunately, I've got bad news. This is impossible because the problem is actually undecidable by numerical evaluation. And here's the argument and proof and so on. And I said, that can't be right. So, okay, I'm going to explain it to you again next time we meet. And here's the argument. Very carefully went through all of this. And here's the argument why hybrid systems and image computation is numerically undecidable, no matter what you're trying. Even though there's extremely strong assumptions, it's still undecidable. And he said, but I don't want it to be undecidable. I think you're going to have to think of something better. I said, okay, good. Let me think about that. And then I looked at the Blum-Smale real numerical Turing machine model as an extremely strong machine model to see if that would finally give us some decidability results. Sadly, that was still undecidable. Even this extremely strong model of computation is still not possible. And of course, you can't change the answer if sadly the answer is that it's undecidable. But on the other hand, his insistence spurred a number of interesting questions, namely, what additional assumptions can you add to your numerical image computation problem to make it ultimately decidable? And that was interesting to carve out this very delicate, weird boundary of when can you do it and when can you not do it. And still nowadays, very often do I point people who are trying something, or maybe even who wrote papers about something, to this 2007 paper, fairly old now, to look at what are the assumptions they have been missing, because it can't be right like that, and then they have sort of a quote unquote informal decision tree of choices in the menu of what they should be adding to make this work. And that was certainly Ed's insistence on, I want this to be decidable, that ever even got to this point.
Right. Actually, I think that's a really good point there somewhere, because it's easy to be, I've made this mistake before of getting a negative result, an undecidability result, and saying, oh, that closes the problem. right? Whereas in fact, you want to push that further and say, okay, well, under what assumptions, are there realistic assumptions under which the problem might be decidable and so on. And someone with a greater degree of persistence and perhaps wisdom, would push past that, right? Yeah, so I like that. I don't want it to be undecidable. I like that. I like that statement. Yeah, and maybe that's characteristic of people who are very successful in research, that they just always look past these things and say, well, okay, I have that negative result, but how can I turn that into a positive result? Yeah. Okay, so is there anything else that anyone would like to share about Ed or Bob? Memories or thoughts or experiences working with them?
Maybe I should add a little bit more about his personality, things that Somesh said about being so warm and welcoming to his visitors. I actually came to him, I realized later on that I was his first postdoc. And then I kept coming to Carnegie Mellon and visiting for every summer for almost 30 years. And I learned so much. Every summer there were new ideas, new people, and the atmosphere was such that they welcome you, they wanted to work with you, they wanted to share their ideas. It was not everyone for themselves, so it was very enriching. So this was on the professional side, and on the personal side, he and Marta were really welcoming. They always had a home, an evening at home and at their home, where they invited everyone, and the atmosphere was so light and warm and nice for the students from all over the world. It was amazing.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the atmosphere in that group was just always, there was just a certain excitement in the air in that group, I think, and it has something to do with just Ed's enthusiasm for new ideas and so on. And I guess there's one thing that I wanted to say, to add, because David, talked about luck, being lucky, right? And I think that's what happened to me. I was really lucky to wind up as Ed's graduate student, and not only as Ed's graduate student, but as Ed's graduate student at a particular time. And that was just really an amazing piece of good fortune for me. And then I had the good fortune, he connected me with Bob Kurshan, my very first year as a graduate student, and I just had the very good fortune to be mentored by both of these people that we have lost this year. And I think that it was just luck, and so that's something that there's not much to say, but just to appreciate that sometimes you just get lucky. So
Ranjit said in this chat that he wants to say something.
Oh yeah, Ranjit, go ahead.
Oh, I just a brief comment, which is, Sanjeeva just reminded me, and I'm sort of jogged my memories. One of the things that really got me into research a long time ago, this is when I was an undergraduate back in Delhi. I was working on symbolic model checking, and I remember writing to Ed about about one thing or the other. It was just like a random undergrad, and I wrote to him about, this is back in the day. It was this you could not get things on the internet and so on. And I was so struck by the fact that Ed FedExed to me, to my dorm room, copies of of Ken's, of the 10 to the 20 paper, the symbolic. I mean, you can just, it's unbelievable to me now. Now that I'm a professor myself, that somebody like him would take the time to print these things out and FedEx them halfway across the world. And I actually, while I'm at it, I want to embarrass Randy a little bit also, because around the same time I was tinkering around with BDDs, And I had a question about, eliminating existential quantifiers. And, I was like, well, Randy Bryant, let me just write to Randy Bryant. And I don't know, maybe Randy Bryant can point me to something. And again, Randy wrote back this epic email, sort of delineating various algorithms, various different trade-offs between different quantifiers, sort of elimination heuristics in BDD solvers. And the older I get, the more astonished I am by that email, because I simply cannot fathom writing such a long, taking the time to write such a long email now to somebody who just cold emailed me about a bunch of details in a paper I wrote 10 years ago. So thank you, Randy, and thank you, Ed.
So I
Tim,
have
did
no
you want
memory of that email, but I might learn from it if you'd send it back to me.
Right. Well, it's a high standard to live up to, Ranjit, but you just have to pay it forward,
Tim, did you want to pick up on your chat contribution? Tim?
You're speaking to me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can say a bit. Of course, I never worked really scientifically with neither Ed nor Bob. I mainly discussed with them, maybe heated discussions, but always in sort of I would say in a way so that we were still things were still good afterwards. I was very fortunate of being asked to actually host CAB in '91, the third CAB. I attended the first one. It was not called CAB in '89. It was fantastic. It was really, Europe meeting US. I was not used to US. Everything was trace equivalences. I was preaching bisimulation, and I really had long discussions with Bob about what was the right equivalence, and I don't think we settled it. But these were good discussions, I would say. And so I actually turned out to be a PhD student of Robin Milner, but I was actually 1 year PhD student of Dana Scott at CMU. I left for various reasons. Things are good with me and Dana now, so everything is fine. I was doing domain theory, and I knew Ed because of his work on Hall logic. And then suddenly there was this talk announced saying, "Oh, now I'm going to prove, how you can algorithmically solve a halting problem and whatever." Of course, this was his first, talks on model checking. So I thought, my God, this is crazy. I mean, these are undecidable problems. How can you, try to attempt, having algorithms solving those? So I went to the talk. I heard it, and then of course he came afterwards to CMU, but that was after I left. So maybe I should have stayed. I don't know. But I think this whole CAB was really extremely good in sort of. And now we have email and everything, and then we are sitting discussing here over online medium, so it's fantastic. But it was not like that in those days. You really had these things you had to type on paper and send and whatever. So I was not meeting many people from the US. So this was really, CAB was really a fantastic thing, and definitely Ed was there, but Bob was just behind him, backing up. I think Bob was actually in charge of the finances at CAB for a long time, as I remember it. So yeah. They certainly was, their contribution to having Europe and US tradition in understanding complex concurrent system was very good for me.
Thank you, Kim. Okay, so I guess it's probably time to bring the session to a close. This has been a wonderful session to hear everyone's memories and get their perspectives on Ed and Bob, personally and in terms of work. And it's just been really sad to lose both Ed and Bob this year. But it was good. It was really good. I really appreciate everyone's contributions and going back along memory lane. So we will have I guess we have a half an hour break now. and then we will recommence. And let's see. Hopefully the video will work, and we will have a session with Emina Torlock and Nate Foster and Daniel Schwartz-Narbonne. So I'll see everybody. We'll see everybody in half an hour. And okay. So Amelia, would you like to go ahead and share your screen?
Yes.
All right.
Okay, here we go.
Good. Well, welcome everyone back from the break. I hope everyone is well rested and has had their coffee or whatever is required at the time of day that we're at. So we have a number of interesting talks now in this session. The first one is from Emina Torlock, who's going to talk about software-aided verification for system software, which is applying this remarkable tool called Rosette to do system software verification. And I'm very much looking forward to it. So Mina, please go ahead.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you all for being here. It's really a pleasure to join you today and talk a little bit about some of the work that we have been doing in the UNSAT group at the University of Washington. You can find out more about the work that I talk about today and in general what we do at unsat.org. This particular talk is going to be about a technology stack that we have been building for either a few or many years, depending on how you count. And the stack is really concerned with verifying low-level systems components. So think operating system components, security monitors, and so on. The talk will have two parts. In the first part, I'm going to tell you about the language that I've been working on since 2011, and it's called Rosette. The purpose of this language is to enable people to rapidly create verification and synthesis tools that are based on reduction to SMT. Rosette has been first released in 2014, and since that release, it has been used for over 30 tools in both industry and academia, covering a very wide range of domains. For example, verifying the control software of a radiation therapy machine that is in current clinical use at the University of Washington, as well as synthesizing GPU kernels, which are faster than expert handwritten code. So first, we're going to talk about Rosette, and the application of Rosette that I'm going to go into some detail today is called Jitterbug, and it is a framework for building and verifying just-in-time compilers for the Extended Berkeley Packet Filter Language, or BPF. BPF is a widely used mechanism for extending the functionality of the Linux kernel, and we have managed to use Jitterbug to verify all the JIT compilers that are currently in Linux, as well as build a new one that is also verified using this technology. So to start with, I'm briefly going to tell you what solver-aided programming language is. I'm going to breeze through this part because I know that all of these things are basic to the people on this call. Then I will show you how to use Rosette to actually build a verifier and a synthesizer for a very simple language. So in the classic programming setting, you have a specification in your mind and you write a program that hopefully matches that specification. If you don't have any tools, the way that you're going to check that your program meets the spec is by writing test cases. So in this case, we're going to write some assertions and we're going to check that the program has the right behavior on particular inputs. Now, we want to keep this workflow intact. We're not going to ask the programmer to do any more annotations, but we would like to give them more analysis power. The way that we do that is by replacing these concrete inputs with symbolic values. So here, this blue X stands for an arbitrary integer. And the value or the interpretation of this integer is going to be determined by the tool with the aid of an SMT solver, depending on what kind of question we're asking about the program behavior. So there are many different queries that you can ask, but the two most well-known ones are verification and synthesis. The verifier asks whether there exists a concrete interpretation X, okay, on which the program produces an incorrect output. The tool calculates this, it does the search by translating the semantics of this program P to constraints and the semantics of the specification to constraints and checking whether this existentially quantified formula has a solution. If not, we know that the program is correct. If it does, it represents a real counterexample, so an input on which the program fails. So in this case, 42. Synthesis lets us, among other things, repair code. So we can replace the part of the program that's buggy with these double question marks. This stands for a syntactic hole. And we can ask the tool to search a finite but very large space of expressions for one, if it exists, on which the program always does the right thing. Okay, so it's expressed as a query that looks like this, shown on the slide here. So there exists an expression E such that substituting E for these double question marks makes the program correct on all possible inputs. And in our case, such an expression really does exist. What all of these tools have in common is the need to translate the semantics of programs in some programming language, whatever your source language is, down to constraints. And building this symbolic compiler is really the most difficult part of building a solver-aided tool. Okay, so this usually takes years of work, even if you're not going directly down to an SMT solver, even if you're going down to an intermediate language, and this is not surprising, right? Building a good compiler is hard. So the research question that inspired the work on Rosette back in 2011 was whether it's possible to build these tools without actually building compilers. Can we give the semantics to our source language by just writing an interpreter and then have some system take that interpreter and turn it into a symbolic compiler for that language? The answer is yes, as long as you write your interpreter in a solver-aided host language like Rosette. Rosette runs on top of a non-standard virtual machine, which we call a symbolic virtual machine, that can take the interpreter for your source language and the program running on top of the interpreter and translate the composition of those two functions down to efficiently solvable SMT constraints. And that is the technical challenge that Rosette solves for you. I don't have time to talk about that today, but I will be happy to take any questions on it afterwards in the discussion part of the talk. What I'm going to do now, though, is I'm going to tell you what Rosette looks like, and I'm going to show you how to use it to build a verifier and a synthesizer for a simple language in about 50 lines of code. Okay, so what is Rosette? It is actually an extension of an existing general purpose language. The general purpose language that we chose is called Racket. And Racket is a modern descendant of Scheme and Lisp that has a powerful macro-based metaprogramming system. So Racket itself is designed to help you create new languages, specifically write interpreters or write embedded DSLs. And Rosette exposes all that functionality to its users as well, making it easy for you to embed the semantics of the source language that you care about into Rosette. Okay. So in addition to being able to write an interpreter for your language, you also have to be able to formulate queries about this language in order to build tools. And we formulate those queries using 6 constructs that Rosette adds to Racket. And they're shown right here. We have a construct that allows you to introduce symbolic values of a given type into your program. You can assert the properties of the program that you care about. You can make assumptions, and you can issue queries. We support several queries, but the ones that we're interested in today are going to be the verification and the synthesis query. So let me show you how we build tools with Rosette. We are going to target a very simple source language. I'm going to call it BV, which stands for bit vectors. You can think of it as the arithmetic subset of an ISA. Okay, so no jumps, no control, nothing like that, just pure arithmetic. So obviously writing tools for this language should be as easy as the language is. Okay, so we want to be able to do 3 things. First, we want to be able to test our model of the semantics. This is really important when you're building tools for real systems, because usually the semantics of a system that you're trying to model is going to be given as some black box, right? A CPU. So you want to be able to test your model by running it, doing some sort of differential testing. And that's what we do, for example, when we model x86 or RISC-V or things like that. Okay, so testing is really important. You want to be able to test your programs and your interpreter. You want to be able to verify and synthesize programs in this language in our little example. We're going to do all of this in about 50 lines of code, and most of that is the interpreter. I'm going to show you the main interpreter loop, that's 10 lines of code, and the remaining 40 lines of code are implementing these very simple helper functions that I'm going to be calling from the main loop. Then we're going to get the verifier and the synthesizer for this language for free. And by that, I mean, we're going to write just a couple of lines of code each for both of those. All right, so here is what the interpreter for this language is going to look like. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to write a little parser, which is going to take our surface syntax and translate it into some data structures that our interpreter can consume. So I've chosen a pretty simple representation here. A program is just a list of instructions. Each instruction contains the ID of the output register to which we're going to write, the opcode, and then the IDs of the input registers from which we're going to read our values. So given this parse tree and the inputs, the interpreter is going to work as follows. First, it's going to allocate enough registers to execute the program and populate the first n of them with the n inputs to the program. Then we are going to use Racket's pattern matching to bind the local variables out, opcode, and in to the output register, the opcode, and the list of input register identifiers. Then we're going to call this helper procedure lookup to look up the opcode and to get the lambda, the procedure that actually implements the semantics of this instruction. We're going to bind it to this local variable op. Then we are going to load the values from the input registers to the local variable arguments. We are going to apply the operator procedure to the arguments, store the results in the output register, and do that for every single instruction. When we're done, the value that's stored in the last register is the output of the program. So this is a super simple interpreter, but as you can see, Rosette allows you to use very complex language constructs. Okay, you can use pattern matching in Racket, you can use first-class procedures, higher procedures, and all of that will be reduced to SMT for you. So to implement the verifier for this language, we are going to use the verify construct in the host language. So at the surface language, the verification looks like this. You give me an implementation. So here, this implementation of BVMax is trying to compute the max of two integers without any branching. And then you give me a spec. The spec can be anything, any kind of a procedure that gives you the meaning of max. And in this case, we're just going to write the max in Rosette itself. And it's the obvious implementation that branches. To implement the verifier, we're going to use define symbolic to create two symbolic integers, so two fresh symbolic values of type integer, and bind them to the local variables x and y. You can use symbolic values in the same way that you can use concrete values of the right type. So you can pass them to the interpreter, you can put them in data structures. Whatever you can do with a normal integer, you can do with a symbolic integer. And finally, to express the semantics of our query, we're going to use an assertion. We're going to assert that for all possible bindings of these values x and y, the interpreter produces the same, the BVMax produces the same output as max, and we're going to verify that this holds for all possible interpretations of x and y. In general, this expression, this verify x per construct, can accept many assertions. So the expression is arbitrary Rosette code. It can emit many assertions, it can emit assumptions and so on. And the verifier is going to analyze all of them and search for a binding if one exists that violates at least one. Okay. In this case, such a binding exists is 0 minus 2, and we can run the interpreter to see that indeed the program produces the incorrect result here. We can fix this using synthesis, and the synthesis query, again, we're using the same trick. We're implementing the synthesis construct in the guest language using the synthesis construct in the host language. The whole here is asking the synthesizer to synthesize 5 instructions using these 4 opcodes, and here is the result. So that's it. This is how you use Rosette to create new tools. You give me an interpreter that gives me the semantics for your source language. You decide what verification synthesis mean in your guest language, and then you implement that semantics using the corresponding constructs in Rosette. Now, let me show you how we have done this, exactly implemented this workflow with interpreters and verifiers to do verification of these BPF just-in-time compilers. So if you're not familiar with BPF, it is a way to add new functionality to the Linux kernel without hacking the kernel itself. For example, if you have to write a new network packet filter, the way that you're going to do that is you're going to write a BPF program. Actually, you'll write a C program, which will be compiled to BPF, and you're going to submit it to the kernel for execution. The kernel will take that BPF program, it will apply the JIT to it to generate the native code, and it will then actually execute the native code. As you can imagine, this is extremely safety and security critical, right? So any miscompilation bug, any bug in the JIT can open up a potential venue for a security attack, because somebody could potentially craft a BPF program that exploits the miscompilation, the difference in semantics, to take over the kernel, to crash it, and so on. So the BPF itself is a very low-level language. Think of it as a virtual RISC-like machine. It's a 64-bit machine. It has just 11 registers, but it has all the opcodes that you want. You can do jumps, you can do calls, you can do arithmetic, and so on, everything that you expect. In fact, it also supports a limited form of concurrency through BPF shared memory maps. So the programs that are running together with the BPF program can write to its shared memory and communicate with it in that way. The way that this execution model works is once the application submits a BPF program to the kernel, the first thing that the kernel does is runs it through a conservative static checker. This checker, of course, will reject some safe programs, but the ones that do end up accepted are guaranteed not to have any undefined behaviors. There are no out-of-bound accesses. There's no division by zero, and they are guaranteed to have bounded execution. So the static checker has to be able to prove that the program terminates in some bounded number of steps, and there's going to be some concrete bound that is determined internally by the system. So once the program passes the checker, it is given to this JIT compiler. So the JIT compiler considers only safe programs, which is actually really nice for verification. We know that all the source programs terminate, which means that we can prove very strong properties about this, the correctness of this compiler that you cannot in general prove about, let's say, a compiler for C.
5 more minutes, Nina.
The way that the BPF compiler works, it is a single pass compiler. So it scans the sequence of BPF instructions, and for each of those instructions, it generates a sequence of target instructions. Okay, so there are no passes. It's just a one-pass compiler. Each of the instructions in the input program generate n instructions for some n in the output program. Okay, and of course, n can vary. So getting these compilers right is very, very hard. So as part of this work, we examined all the Linux commit to this BPF submodule from 2014 and 2020, and we found that at least 82 of them were correctness bugs. They were found in every single JIT targeting every single architecture and every single class of instructions. And it's really difficult to audit and test these exhaustively. And these bugs crept in despite the fact that Linux has an extremely impressive and exhaustive test suite for these JITs. So this is basically what inspired us to build Jitterbug. The first thing that we had to do, of course, is define what it means for a JIT compiler in this setting to be correct. And here we are going to exploit this fact that the JIT is only considering safe programs. So we really know that everything has to terminate. So here is the ideal theorem that we would like to prove, okay? Suppose that we have some arbitrary source programs, some program in BPF, and we execute it on some input data. It will terminate and it will produce some value, and it will generate some trace of externally visible events. So think reads and writes to share memory, calls, and so on. If we look at the program, the target program that was generated by the JIT, it better be the case that after it executes, it terminates, and the value that it produces, as well as the trace of externally visible events, are identical to the one that a source program will produce. So essentially, we're proving by simulation here, along with termination. Now, this ideal statement that I just gave you, we can't prove it with Rosette because Rosette will not do induction. And this clearly requires some sort of inductive reasoning, right? We want to quantify over all programs, which Rosette will not do for you, okay? So what we do instead is we use the lean theorem prover to break down this ideal correctness specification, which we cannot prove in Rosette automatically, into a set of 4 things that we can prove fully automatically. And these 4 properties together imply JIT correctness. The key here is this per instruction correctness property. So remember that our JIT is a 1-pass compiler. So if we can find an invariant property such that if we prove that property holds for the translation of every opcode, then it holds for the translation of the entire program, we're good. And that's exactly what we do. We are going to automate this per instruction correctness translation, as well as the, we're going to verify the prologue correctness and epilogue correctness. I can tell you later what that is. But if you verify all of this, you know that your JIT is correct. To do that, we just built a bunch of interpreters in Rosette. So the JIT implementation itself is built in a subset of the C language, which is embedded in Rosette. And once we verified, we do direct code generation to C for this JIT. It takes as input our source instruction and outputs a sequence of target instructions. We pass both of those things to their respective interpreters. So the interpreter for BPF and the target language, we feed them into step-by-step specification and we check the correctness. I made this all sound very easy. It is not, it is a lot of symbolic evaluation going in. This is pretty difficult to scale, and the details of that are in the paper. So I'm going to leave you with just a few results that we were able to achieve with Jitterbug. So we did develop verified JIT, BPF JIT for RISC-V. So after 5 iterations of code review with Linux kernel developers, it was upstreamed to the kernel in March of 2020. We then ported the existing JIT implementations to our subset of C and tried to verify those. Some of them didn't go through. We found a bunch of bugs and we fixed those and upstreamed the fixes to the kernel as well. We did several other things, including optimizations that, of course, some of them we were able to synthesize and some of them we wrote manually, and we were confident that they were correct because we had the automated verifier for it. And that is it. I would be happy to take any questions now.
Okay, thank you, Amina. So any questions from the audience? I think maybe
I have a question. Where were these, JIT bugs showing up were they in attempts at clever optimizations, or were they just kind of corner cases and
they were mostly corner cases. I don't think many were associated with optimizations because this is so difficult to get right. A lot of optimizations are missing because people are worried about putting them in. It's kind of hard to be confident the optimization is correct. So I think a lot of them were mostly just corner cases. So, as you can see here, there were a bunch of them were in actually correctly implementing the jump instructions, ALU instruction, calls, dealing with memory, and then this prologue and epilogue, which is actually specific to each architecture. So whether the JIT actually correctly obeyed the calling convention, whether it correctly saved the registers, whether it correctly restored them, and so on. So they were basically everywhere, and I think most of them were actually not related to optimization. It's just getting the JIT right because you're working at such a low level. You don't have any IR. You're just generating raw bits as you're scanning this program.
Thanks.
Okay, are there other questions?
I think Ranjit had a question.
Oh, Ranjit, you go first.
Yeah.
Just briefly, Amina, are the other programs, the JIT, the BPF programs, I mean, straight line / loop free, or do they have loops that require some sort of termination kind of reasoning?
They have loops, but the loops are required to be bounded. They literally have some bounds, so you can iterate up to 16 or something. So I'm making up the number, but you can have loops, but they have to be bounded.
Mm-hmm.
So this BPF checker has to be able to prove that your loop terminates within that many steps.
So I'm interested in the interaction between the theorem prover and Rosette. So now in Lean, are you reasoning about C programs in Lean in order to do this decomposition? So Lean never sees the C code?
No, so the Lean, the meta theory is proved at a very abstract level. So we essentially have this notion of you having two machines that have memories and registers and so on, and then you can think of the opcodes as uninterpreted functions. So we actually say what has to hold for any arbitrary implementation, and our inductive invariant, essentially that's what it is, this per instruction correctness, looks pretty much like this general thing. It just basically says that after you execute each instruction, then this thing has to hold. Whatever it returns has to match, and also the trace of events has to match. The trickiest part here is actually determining the termination of the target code. So for the source instruction, it's easy because it's just one instruction, and we have modeled the semantics and we check that our model is correct. Interpreter just does one instruction, it's done. For the target code, this is highly non-trivial because even though the JIT compiler is one pass compiler, it doesn't do multiple transformations. It internally performs optimization. So there is branching in the JIT code, and it will generate different target sequences depending on the properties of the source instruction. So if it has some sort of a constant for which it can generate better code and so on. So this target program that comes out, I called it a sequence of instructions. Really, when you evaluate it symbolically, it's going to be a bunch of symbolic sequences of instructions. So we do have a heuristic that tries to determine when this target program has terminated. And the heuristic is, it works on all of the JITs on which we tried it, but it is heuristic. If it gives a bound that's too small, verification is going to fail, right? So it's going to say there is a bug, even though one may not actually exist. But essentially the heuristic is, and I can tell you that because I know that you're familiar with Rosette, is we track how the program counter changes in the target machine. And if it looks like the program counter has gone out of the bounds of how big the instruction sequence is, we believe that it has terminated. And this turns out to be a good heuristic, and works for all practical JITs. You could imagine some weird JIT for which this heuristic wouldn't give the right bound, but in that case, the verifier would just say that your program is not correct for that instruction.
Okay, I see. So it doesn't require at some point to write an inductive invariant for the JIT compiler itself. I mean,
It does. So we are actually checking that invariant in Rosette. What we proved that it is an invariant for in Lean.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And so what you get out of Lean then is then a collection of lemmas, I assume.
That's correct.
Right, in the calculus constructions that you then have to translate into.
That's right. That's right. So Lean shows that those are lemmas and that they compose. And what Rosette does, it actually discharges them for specific JITs. So the meta theory is parametric. You don't have to feed it the semantics of the target machine. It just says that the target machine has a bunch of functions, right? And then we instantiate it for each architecture and prove it like that.
Okay, nice, thank you. So, okay, there's time for probably another question, if anyone has one. Nate, I think you're muted, or?
I think Nate is muted.
Benjamin, you were in the queue first. Why don't you go ahead? Okay, thank you. A great talk, really interesting. I'm interested in where the boundaries of the methodology are. So for example, is Rosette or this toolchain good at handling non-deterministic specifications or implementations? Can it handle things with randomness in it?
Not this particular one. We're not going to deal with randomness and non-determinism. And in fact, that's a good question. So because we didn't want to deal with any non-determinism or possibly multiple executions, we made our ideal spec here quite strong. So we are requiring the traces of these externally visible events that are produced by the source and the target to be identical. You could actually imagine JIT implementations where these traces are not identical, but the program is still correct in some sense. But that is harder to define and even harder to prove. And it turns out that in practice, when we apply they have to be identical specification to the JITs that were already implemented and the one that we built ourselves, that turned out to be that the strong spec is actually okay. It's not too strong. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It would be much harder if you had to handle a randomness or non-determinism.
Thank you.
Okay, actually, Nate, if you had a question, we probably have a minute to
Yeah, I have a kind of similar question as some of the previous ones. How closely coupled is the jitterbug methodology coupled to the kernel verifier? You said you're sort of exploiting the termination that the kernel verifier enforces, but it also is enforcing various memory safety, and it's also moving target, so it's getting more sophisticated all the time. Does that mean you have to change the way you're doing these proofs, or is it pretty robust to changes in the kernel verifier?
So we just assume that the kernel verifier is correct, right? Which is a big assumption. So we modeled the kernel verifier as saying that it's completely correct. If a program passes the verifier, then it is guaranteed to have the properties that are sufficient for us to prove the termination of the target code and to ensure all of these other properties. Actually verifying, just to clarify, when Nate says BPF verifier, he means the thing that we're calling the BPF checker. So the word verifier is used all over the place, so we call it the BPF checker. The BPF checker is actually a really complex and huge piece of code, and it is a moving target. It is kind of, I think, a form of symbolic execution. That's what it's doing internally to do this. To do these checks. So we just assume that this thing is correct. And right now we are actually looking into eliminating this assumption, let's put it that way. So actually being able to ensure that these constraints hold ourselves. But right now, for the particular talk that I gave, we just assume that the BPF checker does the right thing.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the interesting. Thank you for the interesting talk. So if you could unshare your screen, thanks.
There we go.
And our next speaker is going to be Nate Foster on another quite interesting topic, which is the verification of data planes in network systems. So we're moving from operating systems now into networks. So Nate, please go ahead.
Okay, is my sound okay?
Very good.
Great, okay. So so I wish we could all be in Cambridge. I was on my bike ride this morning on the towpath here where there were some rowers, and I kind of had a mini Cambridge experience, but lovely to have this workshop all the same. So let me start by telling you kind of what a data plane is. Imagine you're this flamingo and you want to order dinner, as one does in 2021 over the internet. So you contact your favorite restaurant. Well, the data plane is all of the components that actually carry your data, from your phone or laptop to servers probably sitting in some data center. So it comprises routers and firewalls and switches, also your network card, also the BPF code that Amina was just telling us about. This is all the data plane. And although data planes are kind of critical infrastructure, the methodology that's been used to develop data planes has really lacked semantic foundations. Most protocols, from the high-level design down to the wire formats, have been developed by the IETF. This is an organization that basically develops internet technologies, and they're famous for their slogan, not we believe in specifications and proof, but we believe in rough consensus and running code. And it's hard to argue with the success of the internet, but in the last couple decades, networking has really kind of flown the IETF nest. These specifications that emerge through consensus-driven protocols have been very slow, and a lot of the really big developers of networks have started to just innovate on their own. So there are all kinds of fancy new things happening in networks, from virtualization technology. This is what powers the cloud. There's a lot of interest right now in congestion control for getting better performance. There's various forms of telemetry for doing debugging. And there's even an emerging area where people are trying to accelerate applications by relocating some of their logic into the data plane, taking advantage of fast hardware. And so, the standards bodies have just not kept pace with this. And one way I would motivate this is, if you think about the programming languages and formal methods community, we spend a lot of time kind of thinking about how to use formal methods to prove correctness properties of our programs, including things like, isolation, say, between processes running on a host and memory safety and so on. And I would say a lot of the action in these larger cloud, cloud structured applications is moving into the infrastructure. And so it's important that we have the same kind of methodologies there as we do for, a C or Java program running on an end host. So there are a bunch of languages for data plane programming. Amina nicely described one of them. Actually, I have a citation to her work there. eDPF is a language for programming the network stack or the data plane in the kernel. There's a language I'm going to talk about called P4, which originated as a DSL for programming routers, but it's since been generalized to talk about not just routers, but also end hosts and network cards and others. And of course, there's folks who are still doing kind of hardware level design of data planes. If you have an FPGA or a network card that can be loaded with some custom hardware design, people are doing that in languages like BlueSpec. So let me just warm up with an example to give you a sense of kind of what these programs do and where some of the bugs lie. So consider this pretty simple topology. And what I'm going to do here is show you how to implement a form of source routing. So this is where the end hosts get to choose the path that their packets take. And we're also going to have some firewalling or access control going on. So that's the ACL. So let's view a packet just as a kind of typed data structure. Here it is. It's got a bunch of sort of structs, and it's got data in those structs. And what's going to happen is if host AA here is sending data to host BB, it's going to indicate the type of packet. This is a source routed packet. It's got this list of hops that encodes the ports that the packet will follow. So this is a very naive form of source routing, but the packet's going to follow that path. And then it's got things like standard addresses, like the source and destination address, and then it's got a payload. So as this packet moves through the network, what the routers are going to do is they're going to look at the source route stack, this list of hops, and they'll use the number that's encoded at the top of the stack to determine where the packet should go. So because this number is 2, it's going to go out port 2, and then the next number is 3, so it goes out port 3, another 3, and then we're at the destination. Okay, so how would we implement this behavior on a router? Well, in a language like P4, you can think of there being really 3 phases of processing. So a packet comes in, it's just a bag of bits, and we're first going to parse it into a typed representation. Once we have that typed representation, we'll have the sort of headers that we've extracted from the front of the packet. We'll have the payload, which is everything else. We may also get some extra metadata that's used on the router locally for processing. And then we'll do some transformations. We'll do lookups in routing tables. We'll manipulate some of the bits in the headers and so on and so forth. And then we will eventually deparse the packet back into its on-the-wire binary representation. So P4 is a DSL, as I said, for writing these kinds of transformations. Let me just show you a couple of snippets of code and kind of give you a sense of how this works. So the parsers in P4 are pretty rich because unlike traditional routers, which just implement standard IETF protocols, in P4 you get to define the protocols yourself and their formats. So the little example I made up with source routing and ACL would go like this. We could write a little snippet of code here. It's really a kind of state machine abstraction. And in this state machine, we're going to populate certain data structures and then use control flow to sort of match on data that we've seen, and then jump to different pieces of code to parse other headers. So I'll just kind of animate this for you. So this is the eventual parsed representation we're going to get that just flashed up on the screen. And as we execute the program, basically we start by extracting the first byte, which tells us the type There's two types of packets in this example, source routed packets and non-source routed packets. This one is. So because it's a source routed packet, we then go parse the hops, and the hops is this list. And we just repeatedly parse the hops record by record. You'll notice that records have 2 bytes. There's the actual hop, and then there's a so-called bottom of stack marker. So if this is 0, it means we're not done. And if it's 1, then we are done. So because this was 0, we're going to go around again and parse hops again. And then on the 3rd time around, we'll have the bottom of stack marker as 1. And then we'll proceed to parse the standard header, which is the source and destination address. Okay, and then we're done. The payload is just everything else. So that's kind of how parsers work. Pretty simple and pretty natural, I think. What about the transformations? Well, the transformations are, you can think of these as basically loop-free C code working on this parsed representation. So there's some metadata that tells us things like what physical port on the router did the packet come in on. And then there's some other data we can set to determine how the packet will be forwarded. This egress spec stands for egress specification. We can use that to sort of control forwarding. And then we can write code that decides, how the packet should be forwarded and maybe manipulate some of its headers. So in this case, for source routing, what we'll do is we'll just use the top of the stack. So that's the 0th entry in hops, and the port component of that. It has a port component and a bottom of stack component. We'll use that to set the egress spec. That says forward out on port 2 in this case. Then we'll pop the stack because we've used up this source route information. And if we're at the end, then we'd have to set the type tag to 0. But since we're not, we'll just proceed to our firewall, which in this case is just denying packets that are from C to D. And since this packet's not from C to D, we're going to allow it. Okay, so this is a little taste of P4, and it's a sort of it's a DSL. It's got some router or network specific features, but otherwise you can sort of think of it as a restricted C, a restricted imperative language that can be compiled to routers and network cards. Now, as a low-level language, even though it was designed in the 21st century, there are some bugs that can arise just by kind of virtue of the language design. So here's one. Here's a packet that an attacker could send from C to D. And what they've done, if you notice, is they've not properly set the bottom of stack marker. So the hops field is the hops record, which is intended here, has a 0 instead of a 1 there. And so now when this thing gets parsed, because the way we wrote our parser, we're actually we'll keep going until we find a bare 1 byte. And in this case, there are none. And so essentially up to some finite limit, the whole packet will be put into this source routed thing. And if our topology happens to just have 1 switch, we can cause packets to get through our firewall because the addresses which are being used to filter in the firewall are actually uninitialized data. So they have arbitrary values, and it's actually pretty likely they wouldn't be the pattern that we were filtering. So this packet would go through. Here's another bug that shows some of the kinds of low-level mistakes that can be made in P4 programs. So this is an example. There's code on the left, but you can just follow what's on the right. So imagine that we're implementing some kind of tunneling protocol where this is often used by internet service providers, where you have a packet that came from a customer and you want to slap on some outer header that the ISP is going to use to carry the packet over to the other end of its network. And then you want to decapsulate the headers that you added, and you're left with the customer's original packet. So in the US, like AT&T does this all the time. So you can end up with what's called 4-in-6 tunneling, where maybe the customer was working with IPv4 packets. This is the kind of standard version of IP, but maybe the ISP is using IPv6. And so it takes the customer packet and it wraps it in an IPv6 packet. So the ISP views the payload as being the customer's packet, but it routes it with IPv6. Now at the end, we want to remove the IPv6 packet and restore the original packet. And so to do that, you could use a couple of tables in P4 where you first sort of remove the inner IPv4 customer data and sort of promote it up to the IPv4 header. And then you'd remove the IPv6 header because that's no longer needed, and update the Ethernet type to IPv4. So pretty simple. And we're just doing it in 2 phases to illustrate a bug that actually does arise in real programs. So the bug arises because there's this weird format in the middle, this weird state of our program,
that is kind of a mishmash of IPv6 and IPv4. We have these, both headers are there, and the Ethernet packet says it's IPv6. And so to tell you a little bit more about these router pipelines, I lied a little bit earlier. I said it was sort of a three-phase processing that happens: parser, process, then deparse. But actually, there's an interesting bit in the middle that I would love to talk about, but don't have time today, called the traffic manager. And this is where packets actually get forwarded physically between ports. It's also where things like queuing happen. So any scheduling or QoS happens here. And for sort of hardware reasons, the packet actually gets deparsed. So it gets serialized before it goes across this TM, and then reparsed before you finish. And so one thing that can happen is, if you wanted to do this two-phase processing, but you decided to serialize this representation, and if you weren't careful, you end up parsing this weird serialized representation you see here on the egress side and get garbage. So here, because the Ethernet type has not been updated, even though both headers are there, they get serialized in some order. And now when you reparse, you're going to parse the IPv4 data as if it was IPv6. And so this is actually a bug that we found in a bunch of extant real-world P4 programs. People usually find it through testing, but it's the kind of mistake you can make that's really befuddling when you first do it. So I want to shift gears now and tell you about a newish project that my group's been working on to try to develop tools that would let us apply formal methods to these kinds of problems. So our system's called Petra, and what we've been doing is building, giving us semantics for P4 in the style of, say, the Popl community, and building accompanying software tools so that we can build things like program verifiers and also do proofs about the language. So we're interested in lots of stuff here. We're interested in sort of straightforward program verification tasks. We're hopeful that actually having a formal semantics for the language can be used by the open source community to guide the language design. And then we're also very interested in building end-to-end verified compilers that go from P4, say, to BPF or C, or even to hardware. So I'm going to have to go a little bit fast for time, but just to tell you at a high level kind of what Petra is, it really has kind of three components right now. There's a OCaml implementation of the language, which is a clean slate interpreter written separately from any other implementations out there. It has a nice design where some of the pieces of the language that are not well specified can be plugged in. We call these architecture plugged-ins. So this is there to fill in gaps in the spec that the language design committee has sort of deliberately left holes in to allow implementers freedom for implementing in the way they want. We've also validated this interpreter against other open source tools like the reference C++ compiler. We also have a formal calculus. So this is this calculus model is not the full language, but a core language. And it has kind of the standard stuff you'd expect, operational semantics, a proof of type soundness and termination. And we've also done some work using it to formalize language extensions. And then in the last 6 months or so, we've been porting both of these to Coq. So mechanizing the semantics, doing the meta theory there, and building some better tools for doing things like reasoning about program equivalence. So I'll just tell you a little bit about how we developed this system. This is a challenge that I think lots of people on this call have solved in other domains. I know, for example, Peter Sewell does this kind of work all the time, trying to take real world systems and extract from them useful but still completely faithful formal artifacts. So P4 itself is defined by an open source design committee. There's a long English spec, which is kind of pseudo formal, and then there's a reference C++ compiler and simulator, which is in the sort of tens of thousands of lines of C++ code. And I just want to show you a couple of pieces where we had to sort of do some work, and there was, I think, some nice solutions to some of these thorny problems. So P4 is a typed language, and it but it doesn't have a description of the type system in the spec. And so in taking programs which are basically a typed C without loops, you have to answer questions like what kind of type inference should be done, when are two types equal, there's various forms of compile time evaluation that happen, and that can affect whether programs type check, what kinds of casts are inserted, and so on. So, you know, the spec really doesn't give us answers to these kinds of questions. There's all kinds of, you know, meant to be normative statements in the spec, but they don't actually nail down even questions like, is the type system nominal or structural? What type of quality means, and so on. And the implementation uses, I think, a tool that's overkill. It has kind of a full-blown Hindley-Milner implementation, even though the type system's a lot simpler. So our solution was to use the simplest type inference tool we could think of. We took Benjamin and Turner's local type inference and applied it to P4. We wrote down a clear description of exactly when compile time evaluation and cast should happen. And we have a type system that consists of sort of an elaborator, which is clearly specified, and then a very simple type system for the typed AST. And this has been used to kind of iron out some holes in the spec and to guide the design of some newer features as well. For the operational semantics, there's kind of similar holes. I will go fairly quickly, but P4 has a kind of non-standard semantics for when objects are initialized. It's got a weird calling convention called copy in, copy out. And so, even simple programs like this, it's not exactly clear what the final value of the state of the program will be at the end. And again, the spec doesn't really offer guidance. I mean, it offers some guidance, but it doesn't nail down these questions. So here we just sort of, followed our noses and made reasonable interpretations and checked it against, the design committee and other implementations. The one piece that I think is kind of interesting is that the spec is deliberately meant to have holes. So there's lots of places where the spec delegates decisions to implementations. And so in our implementation, we had to essentially have a sort of plugin architecture, which is not shown in this diagram, but where pieces of the evaluation are supplied by specific targets. In the interest of time, I think I'll skip a demo. I want to tell you a little bit more about the formalism and some applications. So we also took our interpreter and extracted from that a core calculus, including static and dynamic semantics. And we were able to use this to do some proofs, for example, establishing the soundness of P4's type system and the fact that actually every well-typed program is guaranteed to terminate, which is one of the main properties that P4 is designed to have. We also use this formalization to inform language design. So P4 still actually does not have type-safe unions. It has a limited form of unions for headers, but it doesn't have full-blown sum types. And the design committee got a little bit confused trying to add type-safe unions. And so we formalized that as an extension of core Petra and proved an elaboration back into the core Petra without that. And that's actually been used by the design committee to help guide their implementation. I'll briefly just say we've been working hard for the last 6 months on a mechanization. This is a student named Rudy Peterson. So he's taken core Petra and actually connected it to the front end and kind of gone crazy with developing different kinds of semantics, big step and small step, formalizing the core type system, and then proving meta theory. So if anyone's interested in playing, please talk to me. We'd love to have more people using this. It's a huge amount of engineering, but it's actually quite a beautiful development he has, and I think it's a good basis for other tools. One thing that comes up in this kind of semantics engineering is, how do we know that our semantics actually corresponds to reality? So here we followed the lead of our friends Arjun Guha and Shram Krishnamurthy and others, and basically took the test suite for other P4 targets and did differential testing of our semantics against theirs. This of course uncovered bugs on both sides in our early prototypes and on the other tools. And I think this is a really an important thing for people doing this kind of work to do, because it gives you some confidence that you're not just off writing down definitions in a vacuum. So the lessons learned from this exploration, I think one is that our tools developed over the last 40 years or so are really up to the task. You can take modern industrial languages, even ones that have some warts, and model them in their gory detail. And I think this is something that is preaching to the choir, but having formal specs for building tools is a very useful thing, and I think that the rest of CS and the industry community is coming around to that. Of course, there is sort of it's a heavy lift still to take a big language and model it this way, but in terms of like the underlying mathematical tools, I think we have them. I'll say that selling formal methods to practitioners, I think people really appreciate the value of tools, but selling it as a way to guide language design, that's something that I think is still an upward battle. We've not had a lot of enthusiasm for thinking about formalism in the design process. Okay, if I have maybe one more minute, I just want to tell you about a couple applications. So one thing you can do with this, and I want to be clear, this tool is not built on Petra, but it was built on sort of an earlier semantics for P4 that I did on sabbatical at Barefoot Networks. One thing you can do is standard program verification. So we built a tool called P4V that takes in P4 programs and can do standard verification condition generation and use that to find all kinds of bugs. One interesting twist here is that the P4 program only describes part of the behavior. There's, of course, a control plane that determines the values of the entries in the routing tables. And if you just assume sort of an arbitrary control plane, often that's not a strong enough assumption to verify the program. You need to make some additional assumptions about what kinds of rules will be installed. So that's one piece that's a little bit interesting, is doing verification in the presence of missing code. I'll just skip over this to the next slide in the interest of time. One other thing we've been exploring recently is doing runtime verification. So in collaboration with some folks at Stanford, we've deployed P4 switches as part of a cellular network stack and connected it to a lab of drones. And we've been looking at different kinds of attacks, like a DOS attack, say, where an attacker compromises some of these switches and allows and basically pummels, say, the system that's determining how the drones fly with packets, causing them to lose their control and sort of not be able to follow their course. So I'll just show you screenshots. I'm happy to share this video if people want. It's kind of a fun video. Here's the setup I just showed you, and here's a version without runtime verification running. So this is just running the vanilla system, and this node here gets compromised, and then this attacker basically pummels the motion system with packets. And what's probably hard to see here is that the drones actually kind of go out of formation, and some of them land because they've lost their connection. And then with our system running, what we did is we built basically a runtime monitor for the network, and we deploy checking code that makes sure that every packet at every hop is following a specified path. And so in particular, the attacker's packets are not following specified paths. And now even with the attacker trying to pummel the motion capture system with packets, the drones are able to keep this nice pentagon formation, which is what the flight plan had for them. So this is a nice application of runtime verification, and it's using a model of P4 programs and information about the intended control plane configuration as the basis for doing verification. Okay, so I think I'll wrap up there. I think hopefully I've interested some of you in thinking about network data planes, and in particular P4. If you're interested, Petra is a system that I think gives you a lot of useful tools for deploying formal methods and programming language technology. And I'll stop there and take questions.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much, Dave. I think we have about 5 minutes for questions, if anyone has them. Yeah.
So, Nate, I'd like to ask a question. So this, lovely talk. It actually is a beautiful 1-2 punch with the talk I heard yesterday by Jennifer Rexford at a PI meeting.
Oh yes.
So the question I have is, how do you promote the kind of individual router level implementations and so on to network level properties? I assume the runtime monitoring you were doing was actually, was it a network wide monitoring, or was it just an individual router level monitoring?
Yeah, so for the runtime verification, we are taking a network level view of what paths should be followed. So where the specification, if you like, is every packet at every hop, what's the input and what's the output. So we take that as the spec, and then we build a checker that we decompose hop by hop into the network, so that what the checker is doing is basically checking, did this switch correctly implement, its transfer function for this packet. And so to do that, we need to know sort of what the initial version of the packet was coming in, because of course the switch might have modified the packet while it was doing its job. So we have a sort of instrumentation technique, which right now needs to be trusted, where we basically stash the versions of the packet that we need to see to do the check, and then that's fed into the checker alongside the actual modified packet. And I guess one other detail is that the checker need not run on the same switch. Right now, our checkers do, so we basically reserve a part of the egress pipeline for the checking logic, but there's no reason that you couldn't relocate the checker somewhere else, for example, on an adjacent switch, or even at the edge of the network, say on the end host stack. Of course, doing that kind of relocation raises questions about the integrity of the data that's being used for checking, but that's kind of a separate. We're hoping that we can sort of separate those problems so that the inputs for the checking code and the checker itself run in a place that we can trust.
So it's just still a kind of open issue how you can connect the the composition of these individual sets into a network level plane.
Yeah, so I guess in our current prototype, the spec, if you like, is a hop by hop description of the behavior, and so the decomposition is pretty trivial. You could imagine, and there's some folks at Microsoft who have done some work in this. There's a paper from SIGCOMM 19 on what they call, I think, cloud contracts. Nikolai Bjorner is involved, and Karthik and others. I don't know if you were on this paper, but sorry, I'm always bad at remembering all the authors of papers. But they were interested in taking much higher level descriptions of the intended behavior, and then finding local properties that they could enforce at particular routers. And they're interested in doing things like minimizing the number of the size of the checking code. So if that's the kind of thing you're interested, yes, there's some prior work on that, and it's I think it's an important thing to do, especially at scale.
Thanks.
Well, I see there are some more questions, but I guess maybe those will have to be taken offline because we need to move on to the next talk. But thanks a lot, Nate, for a very, very interesting talk. Very much appreciated. Okay, so our next speaker is going to be Daniel Schwarzenabon from Amazon, who's going to tell us about some work on doing verification for Rust programs.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, very good, and we can hear you.
Great. So yeah, this is talk. It's joint work with a number of my colleagues at Amazon, and also quite a lot of interns who, it's amazing how much work, amazing work interns can do. So this is a talk about a bit precise model checker we've been building for Rust. And so the talk's going to go in three parts. First, I'm going to talk about sort of the background of how we've been doing industrial verification of low-level code at Amazon. Then I'm going to talk about moving from what we've done in the past on the C language to this new opportunity on Rust. And then I'm going to talk about the actual tool that we built and give a demo. And I'd love questions sort of at any time or at the end. So just if you have a question, feel free to jump in with it. So let's start with how we've been doing verification of low-level code at Amazon, at AWS. And we've really reached a milestone for formal methods for C, where SDEs are writing, in particular, memory safety proofs of their own code. And this is a real shift from what we've seen before, where there was sort of a formal verification team. We started out as the, traditional is a formal verification team. We come in, we help the developers. We've now really moved to a self-service model. where in fact, there are verification projects happening that we don't even know about until much later when someone like reaches out for help with something. And it's gotten to the point that for a number of teams, proof is now a routine part of their C software development. If you want details about this, we talk a lot more detail about sort of methodology and how we got here in our ICSI 2020 paper. But to sort of step back, what are we proving? Well, we're really working on the billion-dollar mistake, right? This is, we talked a lot about Tony Hoare, and so we're talking about memory safety. So memory safety means no buffer overflows, it means no bad pointers, no nullity references. And sadly, even in 2020, people write a lot of C code that has this. In fact, Matt Miller at Blue Hat said that 70% of Microsoft patches were for memory safety. And we want to be able to prove, though, things like no untrusted package from the network cause a memory safety error. When we have things like operating systems, like virtual machine managers, like cryptographic code, we absolutely need to be able to prove this. And we need to be able to prove sort of higher level functional property. And the tool that we've been using, which also seems very appropriate for today, is model checking. So model checking, I probably don't need to explain it too much to this audience, but lets us explore all execution of the code on all inputs. And we ask if any assertion in the code can be violated. And if we get no violation, that means we have a proof. Now, of course, this is up to the correctness of the environment that we're using when we build the harness and so on. And up to potentially, we're doing bad model checking the unrolling, although we normally use unwinding assertions to ensure we've done full unrolling. But no violation actually gives a very strong assurance that there is no violation in any execution. And we've been using CVMC for this. And CVMC is nice because it's a bit precise model checker, which means it can actually handle a lot of the crazy stuff that you can do and that people in fact do in C, and things that violate type safety and go crazy, but you still need to verify. In fact, need to verify more. So let's look at this. SDEs have been writing and maintaining proofs. So in the free RTOS, which is an IoT operating system, 12 different SDEs have stepped up to write and maintain proofs across 11 different libraries. So this is not obviously every SDE in the free RTOS team, but across so many different libraries, we've seen a number of engineers step up, and we've seen them actually start writing formal specifications. There's code, and again, we talked about this in our paper, where people are now writing the words pre and post conditions on their functions. And this is not us doing it. This is the engineers writing it themselves. And the engineers really like it. They, in fact, started teaching each other how to write these proofs, because when they do it, they can find and catch these bugs before they escape to customers. And this is a huge win, right? This suddenly means that they start seeing fewer bugs. Their pager isn't going off. They're not responding reactively to things. They're responding proactively. And once they see that first big bug get caught by their own proofs on their own code, they really turn into believers. And one of the key things is actually getting this into the development workflow. So we integrate directly with their CI system. So if you see here, these are all the CI checks they have. And at the bottom, this is the CVMC proof. And you'll notice this is actually required. You cannot commit to a number of our open source projects unless you have passed all of the CVMC proofs on every commit. And in order to enable this, we've invested a lot in tooling. So we don't just run CI, we actually have like a user interface that's based on a lot of back and forth with the engineers that provides them with the information they need to debug proof failures. And it's also, they use it in customer communication. This is a free RTOS blog post from the free RTOS operating system. This is the README from the Core MQTT client library. And they're talking about proof as a customer-centric selling point, as a reason to use this software. This has been really exciting to us. So now the next question, what happens now? Where do we go from here? Well, we want to talk about Rust code. So we all heard the Prousty talk. We know how great Rust is. But we also want to prove beyond, and so people are writing more and more in Rust, and we want to be able to support those developers. We want to be able to prove that the Rust code never panics. We want to be able to prove that their Rust code is memory safe, even if they're using unsafe regions. And this is particularly important for some of the low-level code that people are writing here. We want to prove that there's no undefined behavior, even in unsafe regions. because Rust actually has a more expansive, in some ways, view of undefined behavior than C. There's things that are legal in C, but are illegal in Rust. Like if you write an invalid value to a pointer and never read it, that's still UB in Rust. And we want to prove that code is functionally correct and respects pre and post conditions. So Rust is a great language, and we heard a lot about this in the Prousty talk, right? It provides strong guarantees with its type system. But Rust also creates a lot of new problems, because when you're writing low-level systems code, you end up having to break outside the Rust type system, either because you're interfacing with hardware, because you want to do algorithms that don't fit nicely into the Rust borrow model, or just because you need performance that you can't get out of the Rust system. And as soon as you do that, Rust guarantees all go away. It's the responsibility of the programmer to get it right. And if they get anything wrong, as with C, you're in undefined behavior territory and everything goes wrong. And my favorite part of this actually, and this is from the Rust official documentation, is this thing in red here. There is in fact currently no formal semantics that tells a programmer what they are and are not allowed to do in an unsafe block. You're basically pretty much completely on your own. They have documentation that's like, this will probably work and this is almost certainly deadly, but the developers really does not have tool support. They do not even have great language support once you go into unsafe code. And the problem is that we actually need unsafe code. So at Amazon, we really try to take a customer-driven approach, right? We start with who is our customer, what are their needs, what can we solve it? And in this case, our first and primary customer for RMC has been the Firecracker team. So Firecracker is an open source virtual machine manager. It's written in Rust, and it's becoming the benchmark, the basis for a lot of AWS virtualization technology. So it's absolutely critical that it be secure. It's absolutely critical that it be correct. And it uses a lot of really low level stuff because it has to do things like interface with hardware. It has to do things like maintain data structures that are hard to do in the Rust model. So targeting this kind of code needs an approach like we've done with C. It needs to have something that can really deal with the unsafe code. Okay, so now let's talk about the tool RMC that we've actually built. And now I'm going to switch my screen share to a demo. Can you see, can people see this code? Do I need to increase the font sizes? I'm going to assume from the, it's pretty small. How's this?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. All right. So let's talk about starting sort of small. Let's talk about Rust. So Rust is a safe language, but even in the safe subset of Rust, there actually can be panics. There can be crashes. So in some cases, for example, if you have a slice here, this slice has a dynamically defined size. And what Rust does is at runtime, will check if you violate, if you go outside the size, and will throw an error and basically core dump. And if you're running application software, this is annoying. If you're running low-level software like a virtual machine manager, and a core dump actually brings down a customer machine, this is something you never want to happen. So we can catch this type of dump. And as you see here, we have a small harness, and we run it, and as expected, we get a failure on the assertion that we're out of bounds. Now, Rust also, as I said, has unsafe code. So if we have unsafe code that dereferences a pointer, there's in fact no check that this is done. So in the first case, you at least get a core dump. If you have unsafe code, Rust has no runtime checks. And we can actually see that by if we run RMC in sort of bare metal mode, where it's just checking the built-in Rust checks, we don't get a failure here. Rust will happily run this code, will happily deal with uninitialized or invalid memory, and anything can happen. So what we can do here is we can actually turn on one of our automatic checkers. We can check that all pointers that are used in both safe and unsafe regions are valid. And if we do that, we see that we get failures. This is one funny thing, a little bit of the way CBMC goes, is that we actually get multiple potential failures out of the same line. That's just because it says, well, you haven't constrained this pointer, so it could be a dead object. It could be a null object. It could be a dynamic, deallocated object. There's a bunch of different ways that pointer could be invalid, and it will give you a trace for each of them. But the nice thing here is that we can actually go across, the boundary of safe and unsafe code and verify those together. So those are some nice sort of micro benchmarks, but we can go a little deeper. And by the way, I'm happy to take questions during this demo if there's anything that's sort of confusing or not clear as I'm going along. Let's go a little deeper. Let's look at a functional property. So this is binary search. And binary search has this classic thing of being one of the algorithms that people get almost right. I believe there is an example in Java where their binary search algorithm had a subtle integer overflow bug that had been in there for many years before it was caught. And so this is an example of binary search from Rosetta code that has a subtle bug in it. And here's a different implementation that doesn't have the bug. And so we can actually now check correctness by having a harness where we check that we get the same result from the correct and the incorrect binary search. So let's run that. This one's going to take a little longer because now we're doing something a little more interesting. But essentially in about 15 to 20 seconds, we should see a result pop up. And we should see, yes, so we can actually take this binary search, we can unroll the loop. So you see here, we're doing bounded model checking, and we've constrained the problem to be inputs of size 10 or less, and we've given it an unwind of 11. So we can show that for the constraint that we've put on our inputs, all programs up to that size. The incorrect one returns the wrong value, can return the wrong value, and the correct one never returns the wrong value. So now let's talk about a few of the, well, actually one other thing we can do here is we can add a trace option. And I'll let that run while I talk about the next thing. So the next thing is one of the big challenges that we've had actually implementing this language has been things to do with dynamic types and things to do particularly with function pointers. So, so this is just a test that shows how we handle closures. And that Rust is actually this funny combination of a very low-level language and a very high-level language, where you have all the functional things you're used to, like matches and closures. And this just shows that we can do closures, we can pass closures to other closures, and the whole thing actually does what you would expect it to. It may seem like a simple example, but it actually turned out to be somewhat difficult just to get the encoding of all of this. And then here's the bit that's actually, to my mind so far, the hardest thing that we've had to deal with in terms of both correctness and performance of the translation, which is dynamic traits. So Rust has a concept of a trait, which is essentially like an interface in a language like Java. So you could have multiple different types that all support the same interface. And these are handled through virtual function calls. And so first of all, let's just show that we can run this. And
5 more minutes, Daniel, by the way.
5 minutes? Okay, great. Yeah. So now let's actually take a little look under the hood. I'd like to just use this as a good example to sort of show what we actually do, what RMC actually is doing behind the scenes. So I ran this trait, and the first thing to see is that it generates a JSON symbol table, and we can look at this quickly. This is the symbol table. This is the JSON representation of a CBMC program. And what we do is we take the Rust language and we turn it into this form, We then compile that into a go-to binary, which is the binary form that CBMC actually operates on, and we execute on that. But one of the really useful things you can see, and if you want to play around with this tool afterwards and see what we're doing behind the hood, is we have a translation back into a C-like language. So we can look at, this is, I say C-like because it's not quite valid C, because we end up using Rust type names, for example. So we have things like spaces and colons in names. So you couldn't actually quite compile this as C. But if you want to understand sort of behind the scenes what the translation is actually looking like, this is really the best way to do it, because you can look at something as if it were C and see exactly what the verification would be. And one of the key things here, and I'll talk a bit about this later, is that we try to very hard to be layout precise to exactly the same layout as you would have. So you can do some of the tricks that people do in unsafe code. And if we want to look at how do we handle vtables, well, we do it in sort of what's the obvious way, right? We say, well, a vtable is a struct, and the struct has some useful data with it of the size and alignment of the dynamic object. And then it just has a table of function pointers which represent the different dynamic functions on here. So when you have a call, you just look in this struct, find the right function pointer, and call through it. And so finally, we are going for, we're customer centric, right? We want to say, can we handle Firecracker? And so this is an example of actually handling some Firecracker code. And this is sort of where our development is right now. We've been pushing more and more into the module and handing more and more of the features that they need. So in particular, this is some code that checks the offset of when you have user memory and the guest operating system wants to access some memory. This is the module that checks whether that has been correct. And we also have in here a check for a use after free bug that had been found at one point and then fixed. And the nice thing here is that we can actually run this. And again, it will take a minute, but we can see that this use after free bug, in fact, was fixed, that we can show that there is no trace that would lead to this time of check to time of use error, which is very nice. But now let's see, sort of in terms of the user experience, what if we insert an error? The line where I'm getting an error, I should have put a tag. Right, so what if we insert an error here? What if we had, for example, an invalid assertion? Well, we can actually visualize that. And one of the things that we've been sort of investing in also is building a visualizer that allows us to step through the trace. And I need to change to. So this is a this is, like I said, a visualizer for the trace for the results from CBMC. And so what we can see here, first of all, is that we get an assertion failure. You can see what line it is. And if we click through, we can actually see the line of code that this corresponds to. We can see coverage metrics for how many lines and various functions are covered by the current model. And generally, what happens with this is you build, you fix your bugs, those coverage numbers go up. And if you see that there's a function where you're missing coverage, that's often an indication that your assumptions are too strong and that you've avoided some important code paths. And if you look at the trace itself, you get a trace that basically steps through step by step every assignment that happened on the way to the error. You can click through to see the lines of code. You can zoom in and out of functions. So like you can in a debugger, you can actually say, I want to collapse all steps that happened on this function call, or I want to see which functions are currently on the stack. And you can actually sort of step through this in a somewhat interactive debugging method. We found for C that this has been very effective in helping engineers do their debugging, and we're hoping that the similar thing will apply for Rust. So that's my demo. And so again, let's just talk about what do we have here. We have a Rust model checker, and the way it's built is we take the Rust compiler, we build to the MIR level, which is the type safe representation, same one that Proust is using, and the type safety is hopefully going to allow us in the future to do some cool things about some cool optimizations I'm happy to talk about afterwards. And then whereas the normal compiler builds LLVM, IR, and executables, we build a go-to binary and use CVMC to resolve verification conditions on it. And as I said, we match the layout used by Rust. And this turns out to be really important because this is some code from the Rust standard library. And you see here this comment: the current implementation relies on slice being layout compatible with the U8 reference type. And so they do things in here where there are transmutes, there are bit casts, where they say, oh, I know that these two things have the same layout, so I'm just going to interpret these bits as this other bit. And if you want to be able to verify any code that actually calls into these parts of the standard library, you actually need to be bit precise to the models that they're expecting. We operate the MIR level, as I said, that allows us access to the strongly typed Rust, and we leverage CVMC as a bit precise backend. Currently, we're doing bounded model checking with unwinding assertions to make sure that we're getting full and coverage checking. There's active work to add function contracts and loop invariants. This is all available open source under it's dual licensed MIT and Apache too, so you're welcome to download it and try it. If you have any issues, ping me or post an issue on the tracker. And we're hiring, so if you know of any students or anybody who would be interested either in internships or in full-time positions, please contact me. Thanks a lot.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Daniel. Let's see. Peter, go ahead. Oh, sorry, there's two Peters. Peter Sewell, go. Sorry. Peter Sewell? Okay, I guess not. Yeah, Peter Mueller, can you go ahead?
Sure, thank you. So thanks for a very nice talk. It's really great work. Could you say a bit more about the actual guarantees you can give? So I understand it's bounded model checking, and I think it depends on the harness that you write. So assuming that you look at the paths that you actually execute within the bounds, are you then sound, or might you still miss bugs because you're not fully modeling the semantics at first?
So we're sound, well, to the extent that, you know, there's no bugs in our code or CVMC or whatever. Mm-hmm. We're sound with respect to the properties that we check. So for example, we check memory safety. We check any user defined assertions. We check all of the runtime assertions that Rust has. We don't currently, for example, have an implementation of stacked borrows. So if somebody, it's undefined behavior in the Rust language to have two live mutable references to the same location. That actually checking that would require quite a lot of bookkeeping. And we don't have support for doing something like that. So some of those higher level type safety properties, we don't currently have checks for. But the sort of standard memory safety and panic freedom, we do have checks for.
Great, and that's already very useful. So thanks a lot. Great.
Okay, question from Armin.
Yeah, I was going into the same direction, but like for this impressive table for the C proofs you had like the queue with, I don't know, like 70 proofs. When you write their proof, are these bounded proofs, or do you only check properties where you just, for instance, don't need loop invariances? Or so what's your sort of notion of proofs your engineers are doing? Are these just bounded model checking proofs, or are these?
So these are currently bounded model checking, in many cases, bounded model checking proofs. So there is some support for so for example, CBMC actually does have models for some of the standard like string functions. So if you're doing like a memcopy, it's actually often smart enough that you can view that over an unbounded size, and it will still let you verify. In some cases, there are bounds on the size of the data structure. So yes, it's approved up to data structures of a certain size. There's typically, we try to like do sort of a hand proof to sort of justify that increasing the data structure size wouldn't trigger new behavior. You also look at the code coverage to see that there are no branches that you're missing because of the size. And we use sort of a software engineering discipline of all proofs go through code review.
And then
yeah, that's a current
will you have
weakness.
regressions on this? I mean, will there be sort of bugs in code which you proved correct, and then you later figure out it was because the bound was not big enough? Do you find things?
Interestingly, we haven't had any of those regressions. We did have a couple issues where it turned out that CBMC's model of malloc was less non-deterministic, was like sort of less non-deterministic than the actual C standard allows. And we had an external academic who was looking at some of these proofs be like, oh, well, actually, if you allow malloc to return invalid but non-null results,
okay,
then yeah. So that's where the regressions have actually tended to occur. It's in these sort of weird language corners. But we've not so far, knock on wood, had any like any big escapes of anything like that. And we are, like I said, currently investing quite a bit in trying to add unbounded support to CBMC. And we've shown that there are a lot of proofs that can be moved over fairly easily to the unbounded model once that sort of is sufficiently stable in the CBMC backend.
Okay. So Shankar, did you want to keep the meeting open for a while for people who want to ask questions of any of the speakers, or was that the idea?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So did Peter Sewell actually have his hand up for a question or not?
Yeah, I couldn't really. Yeah, he's got a hand up, but so
I think that may have been a question he asked me in the chat. I could be wrong, but
oh yeah, it could be a leftover hand. I don't know how long they last. So anyway, so I guess
I think what I can do is I can switch off the recording and then we can leave the thing on for further discussions with the speakers. So let me stop the recording now and then we can continue.
Okay, sounds good.